Hey guys, welcome to the Quiet Past historical channel. Tonight we're diving into something a little different. Go ahead and dim those lights. Get comfortable. Maybe grab that weighted blanket you impulse bought at 2 a.m. last Tuesday. We're going to spend the next few hours wandering through the forgotten civilizations of medieval America. And yes, I said medieval, because while Europeans were busy building cathedrals and dying of plague, people over here in the Americas were doing some pretty incredible things that somehow didn't make it into your high school history textbook. Tonight's journey takes us through cultures you've probably never heard of, cities that rivaled anything in Europe, and political dramas that would make the Tudors look downright functional. We're talking about the people who were here long before Columbus showed up, got lost, and decided to take credit for discovering a place where millions of people already lived. But I'm not bitter or anything, so settle in. This is going to be a long one, and that's exactly the point. Let's float back about 1,000 years and see what was really happening in the Americas while Europe was having its medieval moment. Thing is, when most people think about pre-Columbian America, they think about the Aztecs, the Maya, and the Inca. And sure, those civilizations were impressive, but they're also the ones that get all the attention, like the popular kids at a high school reunion. What about everyone else? What about the cultures that built massive cities, developed complex trade networks, and created art that would make Renaissance painters weep, only to be completely forgotten by history? That's what we're here for tonight. The underdogs, the footnotes, the civilizations that deserved better than to be reduced to a single paragraph in a college textbook that costs $400 and will be outdated next semester. Let's start with a question nobody really asks. What was happening in North America during the Middle Ages? And I mean really happening, not the vague hand waving about nomadic tribes that you got in elementary school. Because it turns out, quite a lot was going on. We're talking about cities, empires, trade routes stretching thousands of miles, and political systems that were genuinely sophisticated. But first, we need to talk about Cahokia. Because if you're going to understand anything about medieval North America, you need to understand Cahokia. And most people have never even heard of it, which is kind of embarrassing when you consider it was larger than London at the time. Cahokia was located in what's now southern Illinois, right across the Mississippi River from modern-day St. Louis. And when I say it was a city, I don't mean a little village with some huts. At its peak around 1050 to 1200 AD, Cahokia had a population of somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people. Some estimates go even higher. To put that in perspective, that's bigger than most European cities of the same period. Paris had maybe 25,000 people. London was around 15,000. Cahokia was right there with them. The city was built around these massive earthen mounds. Over 120 of them, actually, though only about 80 survive today, because we've spent the last couple centuries building highways and strip malls over them. Because of course we have. The largest of these mounds, called Monk's Mound, because some Trappist monks decided to build a monastery on top of it in the 1800s, is absolutely enormous. It's 100 feet tall and covers 14 acres at its base. That makes it larger at the base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Just let that sink in for a moment. Building Monk's Mound took an estimated 15 million baskets of soil, carried by hand, one basket at a time. No wheels, no beasts of burden, just people hauling dirt up a growing hill for decades. The organizational capacity required for a project like that is staggering. You need a centralized authority, a labor system, probably some kind of religious or political motivation to convince thousands of people that yes, we really do need to build this absolutely massive pile of dirt. On top of Monk's Mound sat a massive wooden building, probably 105 feet long and 48 feet wide. This was almost certainly the residence of whoever was in charge, the big chief or priest king, or whatever title they used. From up there, you could see the entire city spread out below you. The plazas, the smaller mounds, the wooden palisade wall that surrounded the central ceremonial area, and the thousands of thatched roof houses stretching out in all directions. The people who lived in Cahokia were part of what archaeologists call the Mississippian culture, which is a name that tells you almost nothing, but is what we're stuck with. The Mississippians were mound builders, corn farmers, and apparently pretty good at urban planning. Their culture spread across a huge area of the eastern United States, from the Great Lakes down to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Mississippi River to the Appalachian Mountains. Cahokia was the capital, the center of it all, the place where things happened. But what exactly happened there? That's where things get interesting and also frustrating, because these people didn't have writing, at least not that we found. So everything we know about Cahokia comes from archaeology, which is kind of like trying to understand modern New York City by digging through its garbage dumps in 1,000 years. You'll learn some things, but you'll miss a lot of nuance. What we do know is that Cahokia was a major trade center. Archaeologists have found stuff from all over North America. Copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, shells from the Gulf Coast, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains. This wasn't an isolated little settlement. This was a hub, a place where goods and ideas flowed from thousands of miles away. They were trading with people as far as the Mississippi River could take them, and beyond. The city was carefully planned, which you don't always see in medieval cities. There was a central plaza that covered about 50 acres. 50 acres of open space in the middle of a densely populated city. That's bigger than many modern city parks. Around this plaza were arranged the major mounds, aligned with astronomical precision. These people were tracking the solstices and equinoxes, incorporating cosmic observations into their city planning like some kind of ancient urban astronomers. And then there's Woodhenge. Because apparently one massive mound city wasn't enough. About 850 meters west of Monk's Mound, they built a series of timber circles, basically the American Midwest's answer to Stonehenge, except made of wood. There were actually several of these circles built and rebuilt over time. The largest one had 48 posts arranged in a circle about 410 feet in diameter. One of these posts aligned perfectly with the sunrise on the spring and fall equinoxes when viewed from the center of the circle. Another aligned with the winter solstice sunrise. These people were serious about their astronomy. They were tracking the seasons, probably for agricultural purposes, but also likely for religious ceremonies. The whole city seems to have been designed as a kind of cosmic diagram, a physical manifestation of how they understood the universe, which is pretty heavy stuff for a place most Americans have never heard of. Now, here's where things get a bit darker, because no medieval civilization is complete without some ritualized violence. In the 1960s, archaeologists excavated Mound 72, a ridge-top mound south of Monk's Mound. What they found was, well, a mass grave. Multiple mass graves, actually. Over 270 people were buried there in various pits. One burial contained a man in his 40s, laid out on a platform made of 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a falcon. Fancy. Surrounding him were several other burials, including what appears to be sacrificial victims. In one pit nearby, they found 53 young women, all between the ages of 15 and 30, buried together. Their bodies showed signs of being strangled. In another pit, 4 men were buried without heads or hands. So yeah, Cahokia had human sacrifice, possibly on a pretty large scale. The current theory is that these were retainer sacrifices, people killed to accompany an important person into the afterlife, which is a nice way of saying they murdered a bunch of people for religious reasons. This wasn't unique to Cahokia. Lots of cultures did this, but it's still pretty grim. The people doing the sacrificing probably weren't thinking of it as murder, of course. To them, this was a religious obligation, a cosmic necessity. These deaths maintained the order of the universe, or honored the gods, or ensured a good harvest, or whatever theological justification they used. From our perspective, it's horrifying. From theirs, it was sacred duty. History is full of that kind of thing. But let's not focus entirely on the sacrificial pits. Cahokia was also a center of art and craft production. The people there made beautiful pottery, carved stone figurines, worked copper into ornaments and tools. They created elaborate ceremonial objects that were traded across the continent. Shell beads, copper plates, stone axes that were too fancy to actually use for chopping wood. This was a society with specialized craftspeople, which means they had economic surplus. People could focus on making art because other people were growing enough food to support them. Speaking of food, the Cahokians were primarily farmers. They grew corn, beans, and squash, the classic trio of American agriculture, sometimes called the Three Sisters. They also grew sunflowers, goosefoot, and other crops. They hunted deer, fished in the Mississippi River and its tributaries, and gathered wild plants. The area around Cahokia is incredibly fertile, part of what's called the American Bottom, a floodplain that provided rich soil and regular water access. It was basically perfect for supporting a large population. At some point around 1200 AD, they built a massive wooden palisade around the central part of the city. This wall was about 2 miles long and enclosed an area of about 205 acres. It had guard towers and bastions, and it was built, torn down, and rebuilt several times over about 150 years. Building this wall required thousands of trees, cut down and hauled to the site, and set in trenches and lashed together. It was a massive undertaking. Why build a wall? Well, probably because someone was worried about being attacked. Which raises the question, attacked by whom? We don't really know. Maybe rival cities. Maybe groups from outside the Mississippian culture. Maybe internal factions fighting for control. The wall might have been as much about showing power and control as about actual defense. Look at us. We can marshal the resources to build this massive barrier. We are strong. We are organized. Don't mess with us. But here's the thing about Cahokia that makes it really qualify for our list of forgotten civilizations. Around 1350 AD, the city was largely abandoned. The population declined dramatically. By 1400, Cahokia was basically empty. A ghost town. One of the largest cities in North America just stopped being a city. Why? That's the question that keeps archaeologists up at night. There are theories, of course. Climate change is a popular one. The period from about 1250 to 1450 was cooler and drier in the region, which would have made farming harder. Maybe the population grew too large for the local resources to support. Maybe they cut down too many trees and caused environmental degradation. Deforestation can lead to erosion, which can lead to worse flooding, which can destroy crops. It's a vicious cycle. Or maybe it was political. Maybe the centralized authority collapsed. Maybe there was a revolution. Maybe people just got tired of living in a crowded city and hauling dirt-up mounds for the elite and decided to move somewhere else. Maybe a combination of all of these things. We don't know. The people who left didn't write down their reasons. They just left. By the time European explorers started poking around the Mississippi River Valley in the 1500s and 1600s, Cahokia had been abandoned for over a century. The mounds were still there, obviously, but the city was gone. The descendants of the Cahokians were living in smaller, dispersed communities. Some of the Mississippian culture persisted into the historic period. Groups like the Natchez in Mississippi maintained similar social structures and ceremonial practices into the 1700s. But Cahokia itself was finished. And then Europeans showed up and decided these mounds couldn't possibly have been built by Native Americans. Because of course they did. Early American settlers and scholars came up with all sorts of theories. Maybe it was a lost tribe of Israel. Maybe it was Vikings. Maybe it was some mysterious vanished race that had nothing to do with the indigenous people who were currently living in the area. Anything except the obvious truth that yes, Native Americans built these enormous structures. This kind of thinking wasn't just ignorant. It was actively harmful. It denied indigenous people their own history, their own achievements. It made it easier to justify taking their land and destroying their cultures. If they didn't build these mounds, then they obviously weren't capable of civilization, right? So why should we respect their claims to anything? It was racist nonsense wrapped in pseudo-archaeology, and it persisted well into the 20th century. Thankfully, modern archaeology has thoroughly debunked all of that. We know beyond any doubt that Cahokia was built by the ancestors of modern Native American tribes. The evidence is overwhelming, but the fact that the myth persisted for so long tells you something about how eager people were to erase indigenous achievement from American history. Cahokia deserves to be as famous as any medieval European city. It was larger, more sophisticated, and more carefully planned than most of them. But it's been largely forgotten, relegated to a few paragraphs in textbooks and a state historic site that most people drive past without stopping, which is a shame because Cahokia's story is genuinely fascinating. A massive city that rose, thrived, and fell all before Europeans even knew this continent existed. But Cahokia wasn't alone. It was part of a broader Mississippian culture that included dozens of other mound-building cities and towns spread across the eastern United States. Let's talk about some of the others, because they deserve their moment too. There was Moundville in Alabama, the second largest Mississippian site after Cahokia. Moundville had 29 mounds arranged around a central plaza, with a population of maybe 1,000 people living in the central area, and several thousand more in the surrounding communities. It thrived from about 1000 to 1450 AD, roughly the same period as Cahokia. The largest mound at Moundville is 58 feet tall and covers nearly 2 acres at its base. Like Cahokia, Moundville was carefully planned. The mounds were arranged in a specific pattern, probably reflecting social and religious hierarchies. The bigger your mound, the more important you were. Simple, but effective. The site also has some beautiful artifacts, including stone pallets carved with elaborate designs, copper gorgets, and pottery with intricate geometric patterns. Moundville also had its share of ritualized violence. Archaeologists have found burials with evidence of trophy taking, people buried with clusters of skulls that weren't their own. Warfare and violence were part of Mississippian life, probably involving raiding and occasional larger conflicts between rival centers. It wasn't all peaceful mound building and corn growing. There were political tensions, resource competition, all the usual human drama that leads to people hitting each other with stone axes. Then there was Etowah in Georgia, another major Mississippian center. Etowah had 6 mounds, with the largest being about 63 feet tall. The site was occupied from about 1000 to 1550 AD, making it one of the longer-lasting Mississippian centers. Etowah is particularly known for its stone effigies, including a pair of life-sized marble statues depicting a man and a woman, both seated cross-legged and looking very serene. These statues are incredibly detailed and show a level of artistic skill that would be impressive in any context. Etowah also produced elaborate copper plates with intricate designs showing warriors, dancers, and supernatural beings. These weren't just pretty decorations. They They were symbols of power and status, probably used in ceremonies, and possibly buried with important individuals. The designs show clear connections to what archaeologists call the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, a shared set of religious symbols and practices that spread across the Mississippian world. This ceremonial complex included recurring motifs: birds, especially falcons and eagles, serpents, skulls, hands with eyes in the palms, weeping eyes, and various geometric patterns. These symbols show up in art from Cahokia to Georgia to Oklahoma, suggesting a shared belief system, or at least a shared symbolic language. It's kind of like how Christian symbols show up across medieval Europe. You might not speak the same language, but you recognize a cross when you see one. Out in Oklahoma, there was Spiro Mounds, active from about 800 to 1450 AD. Spiro was a major ceremonial center and trading hub. Site has 12 mounds, and one of them, the Great Mortuary, contained an absolutely staggering collection of artifacts. We're talking thousands of shell beads, copper plates, engraved shells, stone effigy pipes, textiles, and more. It was basically a treasure trove of Mississippian art and ceremonial objects. Unfortunately, the Great Mortuary was looted in the 1930s by people who bought the rights to excavate the site, and then proceeded to tunnel into the mound like they were robbing a tomb, which, to be fair, they basically were. They sold off the artifacts to collectors, destroying the archaeological context in the process. It was a tragedy for science and for understanding Mississippian culture. But the artifacts that survived, including the ones that eventually made it into museums, show just how sophisticated and widespread the Mississippian trade networks were. Items from Spiro have been found in collections across the country, and items from other parts of North America were found at Spiro. This wasn't an isolated backwater. This was a connected, cosmopolitan world with trade routes, diplomatic relations, and cultural exchange happening on a continental scale. Let's float west for a moment, away from the Mississippian mound builders, and talk about what was happening in the Southwest during the medieval period. Because while Cahokia was building its mounds, other cultures were building something entirely different: massive stone pueblos. The ancestral Pueblones, formerly called the Anasazi, until people realized that name was actually a Navajo word meaning ancient enemies. Which is, not great. We're building elaborate cliff dwellings and pueblos across the Four Corners region, where Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico meet. And when I say elaborate, I mean structures that would make medieval European architects nod with approval. The most famous of the ancestral Puebloan sites is probably Mesa Verde in Colorado. But we're going to start with Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, because Chaco was the center of everything for a couple hundred years. And it's genuinely mind-blowing once you understand what was happening there. Chaco Canyon is in northwestern New Mexico, in a relatively remote and harsh environment. It's high desert, arid, with cold winters and hot summers. Not exactly prime real estate. And yet, between about 850 and 1150 AD, the ancestral Puebloans built a complex of massive stone buildings there that served as the ceremonial and administrative center for a culture that spread across some 60,000 square miles. The buildings in Chaco Canyon are called great houses, and that's not an exaggeration. These weren't simple stone huts. These were multi-story apartment complexes made of carefully shaped sandstone blocks, some of them rising 4 or even 5 stories high. The largest of these, Pueblo Bonito, had over 600 rooms and covered almost 2 acres. It was built in stages over about 300 years, starting around 850 AD and reaching its final form by 1150 AD. Pueblo Bonito was shaped like a massive D, with the curved side forming an arc and the straight side closing it off. Inside the arc was a plaza with multiple kivas, which were round ceremonial rooms dug into the ground. Kivas are central to Puebloan culture, used for religious ceremonies, social gatherings, and probably all sorts of activities we can only guess at. Pueblo Bonito had about 32 kivas, including 2 great kivas that were enormous, over 60 feet in diameter. The construction of these buildings required an enormous amount of resources. Archaeologists estimate that over 200,000 wooden beams were used in Chaco Canyon's buildings. Not branches, beams. Big, straight logs that had to be harvested from forests that were 50 to 70 miles away because there weren't enough trees near the canyon itself. These beams, some of which weighed over 600 pounds, were carried by human labor from the forests to the building sites. No pack animals, no wheels, just people hauling massive logs across the desert. Why would anyone do this? That's the question that makes Chaco so fascinating and so frustrating. The canyon couldn't have supported a large permanent population. The environment was too harsh, the water too scarce, the farmland too limited. And yet, clearly, a huge amount of effort went into building these massive structures. The current consensus among archaeologists is that Chaco Canyon was primarily a ceremonial center, not a residential city. Most of the time, relatively few people actually lived there. But periodically, probably at specific times of year tied to religious calendars or agricultural cycles, people would gather from the surrounding region for ceremonies, trading, feasting, and whatever other activities brought communities together. Evidence for this comes from the roads. The Chacons built an extensive network of roads radiating out from the canyon. These weren't just trails worn by feet over time. These were deliberately constructed roads, some of them 30 feet wide, running in straight lines across the desert for miles. Over 400 miles of these roads have been identified, connecting Chaco Canyon to over 150 outlying great houses scattered across the region. Why build such wide, straight roads? You don't need a 30-foot wide highway if you're just walking or carrying goods. Some archaeologists think the roads had ceremonial significance, that they were processional ways used for ritual purposes. Imagine groups of people walking these roads at specific times of year, converging on Chaco Canyon for major ceremonies. The roads themselves would be part of the ritual, a way of literally connecting outlying communities to the center. The buildings at Chaco also show sophisticated astronomical knowledge. Many of them are aligned with solar and lunar events. There's a site called Fajada Butte, where a series of rock slabs creates a pattern of light and shadow that marks the solstices and equinoxes. A spiral petroglyph carved into the rock face is illuminated in specific ways at these astronomically significant times. It's like a stone calendar, a way of tracking the year and marking important ceremonial dates. The Chacones were also importing exotic goods from all over the Southwest and beyond. Macaw feathers from Mexico, over 1,000 miles to the south. Turquoise from mines in the region, worked into elaborate jewelry and ornaments. Pottery from different areas, each with its own distinctive style. Shells from the Gulf of California. Chaco was a hub of trade and cultural exchange, bringing together materials and influences from a vast area. And then, like Cahokia, Chaco Canyon was largely abandoned. Around 1140 AD, construction stopped. By 1200, most people had left. The great houses stood empty, slowly crumbling in the desert wind. Why? Again, we don't know for sure. Climate change is a likely factor. The period from 1130 to 1180 saw a series of severe droughts in the region. If Chaco depended on carefully managed agricultural surpluses and periodic gatherings, a prolonged drought would have made that system unsustainable. There might also have been political and social changes. Maybe the religious authority that held the Chaco system together lost its legitimacy. Maybe people stopped believing in the rituals that brought them to the canyon. Maybe violence and conflict made the journeys too dangerous. Maybe people just decided the old ways weren't working anymore and went looking for something new. Whatever the reason, the ancestral pueblones didn't disappear. They migrated to other areas, reorganized into new communities, and continued their cultural traditions in modified forms. The modern Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona are the descendants of the ancestral pueblones. They know this. Their oral traditions speak of migrations from the north, of ancient places where their ancestors lived. Chaco Canyon is one of those places, and it remains sacred to many Pueblo communities today. While Chaco was thriving, other ancestral Puebloan sites were being built across the region. Mesa Verde in Colorado is probably the most visually dramatic. The cliff dwellings there, built into alcoves in the canyon walls, look like something from a fantasy novel. Cliff Palace, the largest cliff dwelling at Mesa Verde, has 150 rooms and 23 kivas, all tucked into a massive alcove about 90 feet deep and 60 feet high. These weren't built for defense, despite what you might think. They were built there because the alcoves provided natural shelter, protection from rain and snow, and passive solar heating and cooling. In winter, when the sun is low in the sky, it shines deep into the alcoves, warming the stone walls. In summer, when the sun is high, the overhang provides shade, keeping things cool. It's elegant environmental design using nothing but the natural landscape. Building in these alcoves was no joke. Every stone, Every beam, every drop of water had to be carried down into the canyon and then up into the alcove. The builders used hand and toe holds carved into the cliff face, precarious ladders made of wood and rope, and sheer determination. One mistake and you'd fall hundreds of feet to the canyon floor. And yet, they built these elaborate, multi-story structures in these impossible locations because they could, because their culture valued it, because this was where they chose to make their home. Mesa Verde was occupied from about 600 to 1300 AD, with the cliff dwellings being built in the last century or so of occupation. Around 1300, the people left. Again, probably drought was a factor. The late 1200s saw severe droughts across the southwest, but there might also have been social and political pressures. Some evidence suggests increasing violence and conflict in the region during this period. Whatever the reasons, the ancestral Pueblones abandoned Mesa Verde and migrated south and east, where their descendants still live today. Let me take a moment here to address something that bugs me about how these sites are often presented. You'll sometimes hear them described as mysterious or enigmatic, as if we have no idea who built them or why they were abandoned. This is nonsense. We know who built them. The ancestors of modern Pueblo peoples built them. The descendants of those builders are alive today, and they have oral traditions and cultural knowledge about these places. The mystery is mostly a product of archaeologists not having written records, and sometimes not listening to indigenous oral traditions. Yes, there are things we don't know for certain. Yes, some details have been lost to time, but framing these sites as unsolvable mysteries is both intellectually lazy and disrespectful to the people whose ancestors built them. While the ancestral Pueblones were building their stone cities in the Four Corners region, another culture was thriving in the deserts of southern Arizona. The Hohokam, whose name means those who have gone in the Wadam language, developed one of the most sophisticated irrigation systems in pre-Columbian North America. And they did it in one of the most inhospitable environments you can imagine. The Sonoran Desert is hot, dry, and unforgiving. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Annual rainfall is minimal, maybe 7 or 8 inches in a good year. This is not a place where you can just plant some corn and hope for the best. If you want to farm here, you need to bring water to your crops. And that's exactly what the Hohokam did, on a scale that wouldn't be matched in the region until modern times. The Hohokam culture emerged around 300 AD and lasted until about 1450 AD, over 1,000 years of continuous occupation and development. Their heartland was in the Phoenix Basin, along the Salt and Gila rivers. These rivers, fed by snowmelt from distant mountains, provided the water that made everything possible. But rivers don't do you much good if you can't get the water to your fields. So the Hohokam built canals. Not just a few ditches, mind you. We're talking about over 500 miles of major canals, with hundreds of miles more of smaller distribution channels. The main canals were enormous, some of them up to 75 feet wide and 15 feet deep. They ran for miles across the desert, following carefully calculated gradients to keep the water flowing without washing out the canal beds. This required serious engineering knowledge, the kind you develop through generations of trial and error and careful observation. Building these canals was a massive communal effort. The Hohokam didn't have metal tools. They dug these canals using stone, wood, and bone implements. Thousands of people working together, moving earth one basketful at a time, just like at Cahokia, but in the blazing Arizona sun. And then they had to maintain the canals, clearing out silt, repairing erosion damage, adjusting the flow rates. It was constant work, but it paid off. The Hohokam grew corn, beans, squash, cotton, and tobacco in the desert. They supported a population that probably reached 30,000 to 40,000 people at the culture's peak. They built large villages and towns, with the biggest settlement at a place called Snaketown, near modern-day Phoenix. Snaketown, which is what archaeologists called it in the 1930s because they found a lot of snake imagery there, was occupied for over 1,000 years. At its height, around 1100 AD, it covered about 1,500 acres and had a population of several thousand people. The site had over 100 pit houses, which were semi-subterranean dwellings that stayed cool in summer and warm in winter. They also had ball courts, which brings us to one of the most interesting aspects of Hohokam culture. The Hohokam built over 200 ball courts across their territory. These were oval-shaped earthen structures, usually about 80 to 130 feet long, with embankments on the sides where spectators could watch. They're similar to ball courts found in Mesoamerica, suggesting contact and cultural exchange with cultures to the south. The Mesoamerican ball game was a ritualized sport with religious significance, often involving themes of cosmic struggle, death, and rebirth. Whether the Hohokam version had the same meaning, we don't know for sure, but the presence of so many ball courts suggests the game was important to their society. The Hohokam were also master craftspeople. They produced beautiful pottery, often painted with intricate red on buff designs, showing geometric patterns, animals, and human figures. They worked shell imported from the Gulf of California, creating jewelry, ornaments, and ritual objects using techniques like etching, which they might have learned from Mesoamerican cultures or developed independently. They carved stone into palettes, censers, and figurines. They wove cotton into textiles, which have mostly disintegrated over the centuries, but occasionally survive in dry contexts. And they were traders. Hohokam goods have been found hundreds of miles from their heartland. They imported obsidian, turquoise, shells, copper bells, and macaw feathers. They were part of trade networks that connected the Southwest to Mesoamerica and to the Pacific coast. This wasn't an isolated desert culture. This was a sophisticated society plugged into a larger world of exchange and interaction. Around 1450 AD, the Hohokam culture underwent a major transformation. The large villages were abandoned. The irrigation systems fell into disuse. The ball courts were no longer maintained. The culture that emerged after this transition was different, simpler in some ways, more dispersed. These people, the ancestors of the Oadem and Akimel Oadem who live in the region today, maintained some traditions but abandoned others. Why the change? Climate is, once again, a likely culprit. The 1400s saw droughts and floods that would have stressed the irrigation systems. Salt buildup in the soil, a common problem with long-term irrigation, might have made some fields unusable. There might have been political upheaval, maybe conflicts over water rights or control of the canal systems. Managing 500 miles of irrigation infrastructure requires organization and cooperation. If that breaks down, the whole system can collapse pretty quickly. But here's something worth noting. The Hohokam didn't disappear. Their descendants continued to live in the region, farming the river valleys using smaller-scale irrigation. When Spanish explorers arrived in the 1500s, they found thriving Oadem communities. The large-scale system was gone, but the people remained, adapting to new circumstances while maintaining cultural continuity. Let's drift east now, into what's now the desert southwest of New Mexico and Texas, where another culture was building something distinctive during the medieval period. The people of Casas Grandes, in what's now northern Mexico, just south of the New Mexico border, built a city that shows fascinating connections between the Southwest and Mesoamerica. Pacoima, the main city at Casas Grandes, flourished from about 1130 to 1450 AD. At its peak, it had a population of around 2,500 to 3,000 people living in a complex of multi-story adobe buildings. The architecture is distinctive, different from both the ancestral pueblones to the north and the Hohokam to the west. The buildings used rammed earth and adobe brick construction, creating massive walls that could support multiple stories. Pacoima had over 2,000 rooms, some of them quite large by southwestern standards. The city also had sophisticated water management systems, including reservoirs, canals, and underground drains. They even had what appear to be walk-in wells, deep shafts with stairs leading down to the water table. This is engineering on a scale similar to what you'd see in Mesoamerica. And indeed, Pacoima shows strong Mesoamerican influences. The city had eye-shaped ball courts, platform mounds, macaw breeding pens, and metalworking, all of which are more typical of Mesoamerican cultures than southwestern ones. The people at Pacoima were breeding scarlet macaws, probably for their feathers, which were highly valued across the Southwest. Macaw feathers have been found at sites from Chaco Canyon to Hohokam villages to cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde. Pacoima might have been a major source for these exotic items. The city was also a manufacturing center for shell jewelry and copper bells. Workshops at the site show evidence of mass production, with shells being worked into beads, pendants, and other ornaments for export. Copper bells made at Pacoima have been found across the Southwest, recognizable by their distinctive style and composition. So Pacoima was a middleman, a broker sitting between the Southwestern cultures and the more complex societies of Mesoamerica to the south. It imported Mesoamerican goods and ideas, manufactured high-value items and exported them north and west. This made it wealthy and influential, a regional power that shaped trade and cultural exchange across a vast area. And then, like so many other sites we've talked about, Paquiamé was destroyed. Around 1450 to 1475 AD, the city was burned violently. Archaeological evidence suggests warfare, with bodies showing signs of violent death and parts of the city showing evidence of deliberate destruction. Who attacked it and why? We don't know. Maybe it was rival groups from the surrounding area. Maybe it was internal conflict. Maybe it was people from the south. The city was never reoccupied on the same scale, though people continued to live in the area. It's worth taking a step back here and recognizing a pattern. Across the medieval Southwest, we see cultures building impressive settlements, developing sophisticated technologies, participating in vast trade networks, and then undergoing dramatic transformations or collapses around the 1300s to 1500s. This isn't a coincidence. The period from about 1250 to 1450 AD saw significant climate changes across the Southwest. Droughts became more frequent and severe. The medieval warm period, which had made farming easier in many areas, gave way to cooler and more variable conditions. Agricultural systems that had been sustainable for centuries became marginal or failed entirely. But it wasn't just climate. These cultures were also dealing with the stresses of their own success. Large populations strain resources. Complex irrigation systems require constant maintenance. Trade networks depend on political stability. When you've built a civilization on the edge of environmental possibility, it doesn't take much to push things over the edge. A few bad years, a political crisis, some violent conflicts, and suddenly the whole system unravels. And yet, the people survived. They adapted. They moved. They reorganized into new communities with new social structures. When Europeans arrived in the Southwest in the 1500s, they found thriving Pueblo communities, Wadam farmers, and numerous other groups, all of whom were the descendants of these earlier cultures. The great cities were gone, but the people remained, carrying forward traditions that stretched back over 1,000 years. Now, let's float further west, all the way to the Pacific coast, because some genuinely interesting stuff was happening there during the medieval period too. Specifically, let's talk about the Chumash people of Southern California. The Chumash lived along the coast and on the Channel Islands from about Santa Barbara down to Malibu. During the medieval period, roughly 500 to 1500 AD, they developed one of the most complex hunter-gatherer societies in North America. Notice, I said hunter-gatherer, not agricultural. The Chumash didn't farm. They didn't need to. California coast was so abundant with resources that they could support large, sedentary populations without agriculture. The ocean provided fish, shellfish, sea mammals, and seaweed. The land provided acorns, which were a staple food processed through elaborate leaching techniques to remove the bitter tannins. They had deer, rabbits, and various small game. They had seeds, berries, and other plant foods. The environment was essentially a buffet, and the Chumash had perfected the art of harvesting it sustainably. At their peak, the Chumash population was probably around 15,000 to 20,000 people, living in perhaps 150 villages of varying sizes. The largest villages had several hundred inhabitants. They lived in domed houses made of willow poles covered with tule mats, which could be quite large, accommodating extended families. These weren't crude shelters. These were well-constructed, comfortable homes adapted to the mild coastal climate. What made the Chumash particularly sophisticated was their maritime technology. They built ocean-going plank canoes called tamals, which were sewn together using plant fiber cordage and sealed with natural tar that seeped from the ground in the region. These canoes were 12 to 30 feet long, capable of carrying several people plus cargo, and seaworthy enough to make the crossing from the mainland to the Channel Islands, a distance of over 20 miles across open ocean. Building a tamal required specialized knowledge and skill. You had to select the right wood, usually driftwood, redwood, or pine that washed up on the beaches. You had to split the planks, shape them, drill holes for the cordage, sew them together in the right sequence to get the proper hull shape, and seal all the seams. This wasn't something everyone could do. Tamal builders were specialists, members of a guild-like organization that controlled the knowledge and technology. The tamals allowed the Chumash to exploit marine resources far from shore. They could fish in deep water, hunt seals and sea otters, and maintain trade and social connections between the islands and the mainland. They created what archaeologists call a maritime chiefdom, a hierarchical society organized around control of ocean resources and the technology to access them. The Chumash also developed a sophisticated bead-making industry. They manufactured shell beads from olivella and other shells, which served as a form of currency across a huge area of California and beyond. These beads have been found at archaeological sites hundreds of miles inland. The Chumash were essentially minting money, controlling a key medium of exchange in regional trade networks. Their society was hierarchical, with chiefs, an elite class, craft specialists, and commoners. Chiefs controlled access to resources, organized labor for large projects like canoe building, and managed trade relationships. They lived in larger houses, had more possessions, and were buried with more grave goods. This was a stratified society, a chiefdom, which is pretty unusual for hunter-gatherers. Usually, you need agriculture to support that kind of social complexity. But the Chumash managed it through intensive exploitation of marine resources and sophisticated trade. The Chumash also had a rich ceremonial and artistic tradition. They created elaborate rock art, including pictographs painted in sea caves and on rock outcrops. These paintings show geometric designs, celestial symbols, and various figures that probably had religious significance. They carved soapstone into bowls, effigies, and ornaments. They wove baskets so tightly they could hold water. Their material culture was rich and complex, reflecting a society with the time and resources to invest in art and ceremony. When Spanish missions were established in Chumash territory in the late 1700s, the traditional culture was devastated. Thousands of Chumash were forced into the missions, where European diseases killed many and cultural suppression destroyed much of their traditional knowledge. The Tamil building tradition was lost. Many villages were abandoned. The population crashed. But the Chumash didn't disappear either. Their descendants are still here, working to revive cultural traditions, including Tamil building. In 1976, the Chumash Maritime Association was formed to reconstruct the traditional canoes based on archaeological and ethnographic evidence. They've successfully built several Tamils and made the crossing to the Channel Islands, reconnecting with their maritime heritage. It's a powerful reminder that these aren't just ancient histories. These are living cultures with unbroken connections to the past. Let me shift gears and take us way up north now, to the Pacific Northwest. Because what was happening there during the medieval period is equally impressive and also largely overlooked in popular narratives about pre-Columbian America. The peoples of the Northwest Coast, groups like the Tlingit, Haida, Kwakwaka'wakwa, Nuchanulth, Coast Salish, and many others, developed extraordinarily complex societies based on fishing, particularly salmon, and the harvest of other marine and forest resources. Like the Chumash, they were hunter-gatherers who achieved levels of social complexity usually associated with agricultural societies. The Northwest Coast cultures built large plank houses, some of them over 100 feet long, housing extended families or even multiple families. These weren't simple shelters. These were sophisticated wooden buildings with carved house posts, painted facades, and multiple hearths. They required significant carpentry skills to construct, using stone and later metal tools to work massive cedar logs into planks and beams. They carved elaborate totem poles, which served various purposes, including commemorating ancestors, marking important events, displaying family crests, and asserting claims to resources and territories. These poles could be over 50 feet tall, carved from single cedar logs with complex sequences of figures stacked one above another. The artistry involved is extraordinary, combining technical skill with symbolic complexity. Northwest Coast cultures were also famous, or perhaps infamous, for the potlatch ceremony. A potlatch was a feast where a host would give away or even destroy vast amounts of wealth to demonstrate their status and generosity. You'd invite hundreds of people, feed them for days, give them gifts of blankets, canoes, coppers, and other valuables, and sometimes destroy property in displays of wealth. The more you gave away, the higher your status. To European observers, this seemed wasteful and irrational. Why would you destroy wealth? But in the context of Northwest Coast society, it made perfect sense. Status wasn't about accumulating stuff. Status was about your ability to mobilize resources, feed people, and demonstrate generosity. A potlatch was a political statement, an economic transaction, and a religious ceremony all rolled into one. It redistributed wealth, created alliances, and reinforced social hierarchies. These societies were organized into elaborate kinship systems with hereditary chiefs, nobles, commoners, and slaves. Yes, slaves. Northwest Coast cultures practiced slavery, usually of people captured in raids on other groups. Slaves did much of the hard labor, fishing, processing food, and working on construction projects. It's an uncomfortable fact, but it's part of the historical reality. The Northwest Coast peoples were also master mariners. They built huge ocean-going canoes from single cedar logs, some of them over 60 feet long, and capable of carrying 40 or 50 people. They used these canoes to travel up and down the coast, to raid enemies, to trade, and to hunt whales. Whale hunting, practiced particularly by the Nuu-chah-nulth, was a prestigious and dangerous activity. Hunters would go out in canoes with harpoons attached to sealskin floats and engage gray whales in open ocean. It was incredibly risky, and successful whale hunters were high-status individuals. During the medieval period, these cultures flourished. Archaeological evidence suggests increasing population, more elaborate art, and expanded trade networks. Sites show evidence of large-scale fish processing, with drying racks and storage facilities capable of preserving thousands of pounds of salmon. This allowed people to store food for winter, supporting sedentary villages, even in the cold northern climate. The peoples of the Northwest Coast had oral histories stretching back centuries, complex mythologies explaining the origins of the world and their societies, and sophisticated artistic traditions. Their cultures were thriving when Europeans first made contact in the late 1700s, and despite the devastating impacts of colonization and disease, they survive today, maintaining traditions and reviving cultural practices. Let's keep going north, all the way to the Arctic, because even in one of the harshest environments on Earth, human cultures found ways not just to survive, but to thrive during the medieval period. Around 1000 AD, a new culture began spreading across the North American Arctic. These were the Thule people, ancestors of the modern Inuit. They originated in Alaska, and within just a few centuries, had spread all the way across the Arctic to Greenland, replacing or absorbing the earlier Dorset culture that had lived in the region. This rapid expansion was made possible by Thule technological innovations, particularly in hunting marine mammals. The Thule developed sophisticated toggle harpoons with detachable heads connected to floats by long lines. This allowed them to hunt large sea mammals like bowhead whales, bearded seals, and walrus. One bowhead whale could provide meat and blubber to feed a community for months, plus bone and baleen for tools and construction. The Thule built different types of houses depending on the season and location. In summer, they lived in tents made of sealskin stretched over driftwood or whale bone frames. In winter, they built semi-subterranean houses with walls made of sod, stone, or whale bones, and roofs supported by driftwood or whale ribs. Some of these winter houses were quite elaborate, with entrance tunnels that acted as cold traps, raised sleeping platforms, and dedicated storage areas. They traveled using kayaks for hunting and umiaks, larger open boats made of sealskin stretched over wooden frames, for transporting families and cargo. In winter, they used dog sleds to travel across sea ice and snow. Thule dog sleds were sophisticated machines with carefully designed sled runners, lashings that provided some flexibility over rough ice, and teams of dogs bred and trained specifically for pulling. The Thule were master craftspeople, creating beautifully carved ivory and bone objects. They made needles, thimbles, knives, harpoon points, and decorative objects from walrus ivory, whale bone, and caribou antler. Many of these items were decorated with incised designs showing hunting scenes, animals, and geometric patterns. This was functional art, objects that were both useful and beautiful. They also developed sophisticated clothing technology. Surviving in the Arctic requires protection from extreme cold, and the Thule perfected the art of making layered clothing from caribou and seal skins. They made parkas, pants, boots, and mittens using techniques that wouldn't be improved upon until modern synthetic materials. The clothing was designed with careful attention to ventilation, insulation, and waterproofing. A well-made set of Thule winter clothing could keep you alive in temperatures of -40 degrees or colder. The Thule traded across vast distances. Iron, which they obtained from meteorites or traded from Asia via Alaska, has been found at Thule sites across the Arctic. They also traded with Norse settlers in Greenland, obtaining European metal, cloth, and other goods in exchange for ivory, furs, and other Arctic products. Archaeological excavations at Thule sites have turned up Norse artifacts, and Norse sites have yielded Thule-made items, proving contact between the two cultures. This contact was sometimes peaceful, sometimes not. The Norse sagas mention encounters with people they called Skraelings, which probably referred to both the Thule and the earlier Dorset people. Some of these encounters were friendly trading meetings. Others were violent conflicts. The relationship was complicated, as these things usually are when different cultures meet on the edges of the known world. The Thule expansion happened during a period of relative warmth in the Arctic, sometimes called the medieval warm period, roughly 900 to 1300 AD. Warmer temperatures meant less sea ice, which meant bowhead whales could range further east, which meant Thule hunters could follow them, establishing new communities as they went. Climate shaped Thule expansion in fundamental ways. But then things got colder. The Little Ice Age began around 1300 to 1400 AD, and temperatures across the Arctic dropped. Sea ice became more extensive. Bowhead whales became scarcer in many areas. This forced the Thule to adapt, shifting away from large whale hunting and focusing more on seals, caribou, and fish. Communities reorganized, becoming smaller and more mobile. The classic Thule culture transformed into the various regional Inuit cultures that Europeans encountered in later centuries. The Thule weren't building pyramids or carving stone monuments. They weren't creating written records or massive cities, but they were doing something equally impressive. They were living in one of the most challenging environments on Earth, developing technologies and cultural practices that allowed not just survival, but a rich cultural life with art, ceremony, trade, and complex social organization. That deserves recognition. While the Thule were spreading across the Arctic, let's check in on what was happening in the eastern woodlands of North America during the medieval period. Because the Mississippian culture we started with at Cahokia wasn't the only thing going on in that vast region. In the Great Lakes area and the Northeast, various Iroquoian and Algonquian-speaking peoples were developing their own complex societies. These cultures were primarily agricultural, growing the three sisters of corn, beans, and squash, supplemented by hunting, fishing, and gathering. They lived in longhouses, which were exactly what they sound like: long rectangular structures made of wooden poles covered with bark, housing extended families. Some of these longhouses were enormous. Iroquoian longhouses could be over 100 feet long and house 20 or more families, each with their own fire pit along the central corridor. Living in a longhouse required social skills and cooperation. You couldn't just do whatever you wanted. You had to coordinate with your neighbors, share space, manage conflicts, and work together. The longhouse was both a physical structure and a metaphor for social organization. By the late medieval period, some Iroquoian groups were forming confederacies, political alliances among previously independent nations. The most famous of these is the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois Confederacy, which according to tradition was formed sometime between 1100 and 1500 AD, though the exact date is debated. The Confederacy brought together 5 nations: the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. Later, in the 1700s, the Tuscarora would join, making it 6 nations. The Haudenosaunee had a sophisticated political system with councils, procedures for decision-making, and mechanisms for resolving disputes between member nations. Decisions had to be reached by consensus, which required extensive discussion and negotiation. The Confederacy's constitution, preserved in oral tradition and called the Great Law of Peace, established principles of democracy, federalism, and checks and balances that some scholars argue influenced later American and European political thought. Whether the Haudenosaunee actually influenced the U.S. Constitution is debated among historians. Some see clear parallels. Others argue the connections are overstated. But regardless of influence, the fact remains that Iroquoian peoples developed a democratic confederacy with sophisticated governance structures during the medieval period, which kind of undermines any notion that democracy was a uniquely European invention. Iroquoian societies were also notable for the political power held by women. Clan mothers, elder women of high status, had significant influence over political decisions. They selected the male chiefs who represented their clans in council. They could remove chiefs who weren't performing adequately. They controlled the distribution of food and resources. In important matters, particularly decisions about war, the clan mothers' voices carried weight. This was a society where women had real political power, which was not the norm in medieval Europe. The Iroquoian peoples also engaged in warfare, sometimes quite intensely. Different groups competed for territory, resources, and prestige. Warfare involved raiding, ambushes, and occasionally larger battles. Captives were sometimes adopted into the capturing group to replace members lost to death or disease. Other times, captives faced torture and execution in rituals that to European observers seemed incomprehensibly cruel, but which had cultural meanings related to testing courage, appeasing spirits, and demonstrating power. Violence was part of medieval North American life, just as it was part of medieval European life. Different cultures had different practices and meanings around warfare, but violence itself was universal. Pretending that pre-Columbian peoples lived in some peaceful paradise does them no favors. They were complex human societies with all the conflicts, competition, and occasional brutality that entails. Let's drift south now into the southeast, where we've already talked about Mississippian mound builders like Moundville and Etowah. But there's more to discuss, particularly about a site called Poverty Point in Louisiana, which is earlier than our medieval focus, but worth mentioning because it shows just how deep the history of complex societies in North America goes. Poverty Point was built between 1700 and 1100 BC. Yes, BC. Over 3,000 years ago. The site consists of massive earthen ridges arranged in concentric semicircles, plus several mounds, including one in the shape of a bird that's 70 feet tall and 640 feet across. The construction of Poverty Point required moving an estimated 530,000 cubic meters of soil. For context, that's comparable to the amount of material in many Egyptian pyramids. The people who built Poverty Point were hunter-gatherers. They didn't farm, at least not in any significant way. And yet they organized labor on a massive scale to build these earthworks. They also participated in extensive trade networks, importing stone from the Appalachians, copper from the Great Lakes, and shells from the Gulf Coast. This was a complex society emerging from hunting, gathering, and trade, showing that you don't need agriculture to build impressive things or organize large populations. Why am I bringing up Poverty Point in a script about medieval America? Because it establishes something important. The tradition of building large earthworks in North America goes back over 3,000 years. Cahokia wasn't a one-off. It was part of a long tradition of mound building that stretched from the Archaic period through the Mississippian period. This wasn't some sudden development. This was cultural continuity over millennia. By the medieval period, the Southeast was filled with mound building societies. We've talked about some of the big ones, but there were hundreds of smaller sites scattered across the landscape. Each one represented a community organized around ceremonial centers, agricultural production, and trade. These weren't isolated villages. They were nodes in networks of exchange, communication, and cultural influence. The southeastern ceremonial complex, which I mentioned earlier, provides evidence of shared religious beliefs and practices across the region. The symbols show up on copper plates, shell gorgets, pottery, and other objects from Oklahoma to Georgia to Tennessee. These aren't just pretty designs. They're a visual language communicating religious ideas, political authority, and cultural identity. One common motif is the falcon warrior, a human figure with bird-like features, often holding weapons or trophy heads. This image probably represented a mythological being or a category of elite warriors. Another common symbol is the hand with an eye in the palm, which might represent vision, power, or spiritual sight. There are also weeping eyes, often associated with warfare and death, and various serpent images, which in many indigenous American cultures represented the underworld, water, and transformation. These symbols weren't static. They evolved over time, spreading from one region to another, being adopted and modified by different groups. This was a dynamic religious tradition, responding to social changes, incorporating new ideas, and adapting to local contexts. It's evidence of a sophisticated intellectual and spiritual culture that united diverse peoples across a vast region. And then European diseases arrived. Before Europeans themselves even showed up in many areas, European diseases spread through indigenous populations, carried by trade routes and human contact. Smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, and other diseases ravaged communities that had no immunity to these pathogens. The death toll was catastrophic, probably killing between 50 and 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas over the course of a few centuries. By the time Spanish explorers like Hernando de Soto marched through the Southeast in the 1540s, they encountered Mississippian societies that were already in decline, already devastated by disease. De Soto's expedition brought more disease, more violence, more disruption. The expedition itself was a disaster, with hundreds of Spaniards dying, and De Soto himself succumbing to fever somewhere along the Mississippi River. But the damage to indigenous societies was far worse. Within a few generations, the great Mississippian centers were abandoned. The mound building tradition ceased. The elaborate ceremonial complexes collapsed. The populations that survived reorganized into smaller, more dispersed communities. When later European colonists arrived in the 1600s and 1700s, they found a landscape very different from what had existed a century or two earlier. This created a misconception that persists to this day. Europeans saw scattered, relatively small indigenous communities and concluded that North America had always been sparsely populated, that indigenous peoples had never developed complex societies. They didn't realize they were looking at the aftermath of a demographic catastrophe, the ruins of civilizations that had collapsed before Europeans even knew they existed. Let's float west again, into the Great Plains, because something interesting was happening there during the medieval period too, though it's often overlooked because plains cultures are typically associated with horses and bison hunting, which is really more of a post-contact thing. Before horses, which were introduced by Europeans in the 1500s and 1600s, plains peoples hunted bison on foot. This required different strategies than mounted hunting. One common technique was the buffalo jump, where hunters would stampede a herd over a cliff, killing or injuring many animals at once. Sites like Head Smashed in Buffalo Jump in Alberta show evidence of use stretching back thousands of years. Buffalo jumps required careful planning and coordination. You needed scouts to locate the herds. You needed people to build drive lanes, arrangements of stone cairns and brush that would funnel the animals toward the cliff. You needed hunters to start the stampede and keep it going in the right direction. And you needed people at the base of the cliff to butcher the animals and process the meat, hide, and bone before it's spoiled. This was communal labor involving dozens or hundreds of people working together. The meat from a successful buffalo jump would be dried into pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, fat, and sometimes berries that was nutritious, portable, and could last for months. Pemmican was the ultimate survival food, concentrated calories that could get you through the winter or fuel long journeys. The hides would be tanned and made into clothing, tippy covers, and containers. The bones would be worked into tools. Nothing was wasted. During the medieval period, plains peoples also practiced some agriculture in river valleys where conditions were favorable. Groups along the Missouri River, like the Mandan and Hidatsa, built substantial villages with earth lodges, large semi-subterranean structures made of wooden frames covered with earth. These villages could house hundreds of people and served as centers for trade. The Mandan, in particular, developed a sophisticated trading economy. Their villages were located at the intersection of different ecological zones and cultural regions, making them natural trading hubs. They traded agricultural products like corn and squash to more nomadic groups in exchange for bison hides, dried meat, and other products. They also traded with peoples from far away, obtaining shells from the Pacific, copper from the Great Lakes, and obsidian from the Rockies. Mandan villages were carefully planned, with earth lodges arranged around a central plaza. Each earth lodge housed an extended family and could be 40 or 50 feet in diameter. The interior had a central fire pit, raised sleeping platforms around the edges, and storage pits dug into the floor. The roof structure, supported by massive cottonwood posts, was strong enough to support people walking on top, and villagers would sit on the roofs on warm evenings, socializing and watching the plaza below. The Mandan had complex religious ceremonies, including the Akaba, a 4-day ritual involving fasting, dancing, self-torture, and vision quests. Young men would have wooden skewers inserted through the muscles of their chest or back, hang from the lodge poles until the skewers tore free. This was a test of endurance and courage, a way of proving oneself and receiving spiritual power. It was also, from a European perspective, absolutely horrifying, which is why early observers spent a lot of time describing it in shocked detail. The Mandan were hit hard by European diseases, particularly smallpox. Epidemics in 1781 and 1837 killed the vast majority of the population. By the mid-1800s, only a few hundred Mandans survived, where there had been thousands just decades earlier. It was a cultural catastrophe, wiping out villages, knowledge, and traditions that had developed over centuries. Let's take a moment here to talk about something that doesn't fit neatly into any one section, but is important for understanding medieval America. Trade networks. The Americas during the medieval period were connected by vast networks of exchange. These weren't just local trades between neighboring groups. These were continent-spanning networks moving goods, ideas, and cultural practices over thousands of miles. Copper from the Great Lakes has been found in burial sites in the southeast and the southwest. Obsidian from the Rockies has been found on the Great Plains and in the Midwest. Shells from the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific Ocean have been found in landlocked sites far from the coast. Turquoise from the southwest has been found in Mesoamerica. Macaw feathers from Mexico have been found at Chaco Canyon and other southwestern sites. These trade networks connected different cultures, allowing them to share technologies, ideas, and religious practices. The southeastern ceremonial complex spread because people were talking to each other, trading with each other, visiting each other's ceremonial centers. The buffalo jump technique spread across the plains because groups shared knowledge. The mound building tradition spread because people saw mounds elsewhere and thought, we should build one of those. Trade wasn't just about economics. It was about diplomacy, social relationships, and cultural exchange. When you traded with someone, you established a relationship. You created obligations. You opened lines of communication. Trade was how peace was maintained, how alliances were formed, how different groups learned to coexist despite linguistic and cultural differences. And the scale of these networks was genuinely impressive. You could travel from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, and at each stop along the way, you'd find people who were connected through trade to people further along the route. It wasn't one big empire or political unit. It was a complex web of relationships, constantly shifting and adapting, but persistent over centuries. This brings us to an important point about how we think about pre-Columbian America. There's a tendency to think of indigenous societies as isolated, static, and simple. But the reality was far more complex. These were dynamic cultures, engaged in trade, warfare, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. They were building cities, developing technologies, creating art, and grappling with the same kinds of social and political problems that every human society faces. They weren't living in some timeless, unchanging state. They were making history, just like people everywhere. empires rose and fell. Cities were built and abandoned. New religions spread. Technologies were invented and adopted. Political systems evolved. All of this was happening in medieval America, and most of it is completely unknown to the average person today. Let's drift south now, way south, into the Caribbean. Because while we tend to think of Caribbean islands as tropical paradises with not much going on historically, that's completely wrong. The Caribbean during the medieval period was home to sophisticated cultures with complex social organizations, extensive trade networks, and impressive achievements in agriculture, art, and navigation. The dominant culture in the Caribbean during the late medieval period was the Taino, an Arawak-speaking people who lived across the Greater Antilles, including modern-day Cuba, Jamaica, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico. The Taino were agriculturalists, growing cassava, sweet potatoes, corn, beans, squash, peanuts, peppers, and cotton. They also fished extensively and gathered wild plants. Cassava was particularly important. This root crop is drought resistant and produces high yields in tropical conditions. But it's also toxic if not processed correctly. Raw cassava contains cyanide compounds that can kill you. The Taino developed elaborate processing techniques, grating the roots and squeezing out the toxic juices, then drying the pulp and grinding it into flour. This flour could be made into cassava bread, which was a staple food. The Taino lived in villages ranging from a few hundred to several thousand people. The largest settlements were the seats of caciques, hereditary chiefs, who ruled over territories that could include multiple villages. Some caciques controlled entire islands or large portions of islands. This was a hierarchical society with distinct social classes. Caciques at the top, followed by nobles, priests, and commoners. Taino villages were organized around a central plaza where ceremonial activities took place. The most important of these was the ball game, played on rectangular courts called bedtimes. The game involved keeping a rubber ball in the air using hips, shoulders, and elbows. It was similar to the Mesoamerican ball game, suggesting contact and cultural exchange with cultures to the west. The Taino were skilled craftspeople. They carved elaborate stone zemis, which were representations of spirits or ancestors. These zemis could be small personal objects or large public sculptures. They were treated as living beings, housed in special buildings, given offerings, and consulted for advice. The Taino believed that zemis contained spiritual power and could influence events in the world. They also carved intricate wooden objects, made pottery with distinctive geometric designs, wove cotton into cloth, and created jewelry from gold, shell, and bone. Gold was particularly valued, worked into ornaments like nose rings, earrings, and pendants. The Taino weren't mining gold on a large scale, but they collected nuggets from streams and worked them using techniques like hammering and annealing. Taino society was matrilineal, meaning inheritance and kinship were traced through the mother's line. When a cacique died, his successor was typically his sister's son, not his own son. This gave women, particularly high-status women, significant social and political power. Some caciques were women, ruling in their own right, which shocked Spanish observers who came from a culture where women were largely excluded from formal political power. The Taino were also accomplished navigators. They built large dugout canoes, some of them capable of carrying 50 or more people, carved from single massive tree trunks. These canoes allowed them to travel between islands, maintaining trade networks and social connections across hundreds of miles of open ocean. They traded food, tools, gold, and other goods. They maintained diplomatic relationships between different cacicazgos, the territories controlled by individual caciques. They raided enemies and formed alliances. The islands weren't isolated. This was a connected world with regular travel and communication. People on Puerto Rico knew what was happening on Hispaniola. News, gossip, and information flowed along with trade goods. When something significant happened, word spread. This was a functioning regional system with its own politics, economics, and cultural dynamics. And then Columbus showed up in 1492. And everything went to hell very, very quickly. Columbus landed in the Bahamas, which were inhabited by Lucian people, culturally related to the Taino. Within 25 years, every single Lucian was dead or enslaved and shipped elsewhere. Gone. An entire population wiped out in a generation. On Hispaniola, the Taino population before contact was probably around 250,000 to 1 million people. Estimates vary widely, but even the lowest estimates suggest a large population. By 1550, there were maybe 500 Taino left on Hispaniola. By 1600, the Spanish considered them extinct. Disease was the primary killer. Smallpox, measles, typhus, and other European diseases swept through populations with no immunity. But disease wasn't the only factor. The Spanish enslaved Taino people, forcing them to work in gold mines and on plantations. They disrupted agricultural systems, leading to famine. They waged war on groups that resisted. The combination was apocalyptic. The Taino didn't disappear completely, despite Spanish declarations of extinction. Some fled to remote areas. Some intermarried with Africans and Europeans. Modern genetic studies show that many people in the Caribbean, particularly in Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, have significant Taino ancestry. There are also people today who identify as Taino, working to revive cultural traditions and language. But the culture that existed in 1492, the thriving civilization with its caciques and zemis and ball courts, was shattered beyond recovery within a few decades. While we're in the Caribbean, let's talk about the people who were on the smaller islands of the Lesser Antilles during the medieval period. These were the island Caribs, also called the Kalinago, who gave their name to the Caribbean Sea. The island Caribs were relative newcomers to the islands, having migrated from South America sometime around 1200 to 1400 AD, displacing or absorbing earlier populations. The island Caribs were more mobile and warlike than the Taino. They They lived in smaller settlements, relied more heavily on fishing and raiding, and had a reputation, probably somewhat exaggerated by European sources, as fierce warriors and cannibals. The Spanish and later European colonizers were terrified of the island Caribs and used stories about their ferocity to justify enslavement and violence. Were the island Caribs actually cannibals? Maybe. Ritual cannibalism, consuming small portions of enemies to absorb their strength or courage, was practiced by various indigenous American cultures. But the lurid stories about massive cannibal feasts were almost certainly Spanish propaganda, designed to dehumanize indigenous people and justify their destruction. The Spanish had economic and political reasons to paint the island Caribs as savage monsters. It made it easier to enslave them and take their land. The island Caribs were skilled navigators, using large dugout canoes to travel between islands and launch raids on Taino settlements and later European colonies. They resisted European colonization far more successfully than the Taino, maintaining their independence on some islands well into the 1700s. They adapted European technologies, acquiring metal tools and firearms through trade and raiding, and used them to defend their territories. The island Caribs also had complex social structures, with separate men's and women's languages. Men and women spoke differently, using distinct vocabularies for many common words. This probably originated from the fact that island Carib men spoke a Caribbean language, while women spoke an Arawakan language, reflecting the culture's origin in raids on Arawak-speaking peoples and the incorporation of captive women. Over time, the languages merged into a single Creole with gendered variations. It's a fascinating example of how warfare, captivity, and cultural blending can produce unique linguistic outcomes. But like the Taino, the island Caribs were devastated by European contact. Disease, warfare, and enslavement reduced their population dramatically. Today, there's a small Kalinago community on the island of Dominica, the only surviving population that maintains a distinct identity. They're working to preserve their language, which is nearly extinct, and their cultural traditions. It's a tiny remnant of what was once a vibrant culture spread across dozens of islands. Let's continue south, into South America. Because while this script is primarily focused on North America and the Caribbean, we should at least acknowledge what was happening further south during the medieval period, because it was significant. The Andes region during medieval times was home to various sophisticated cultures, predecessors to the Inca Empire that would emerge in the 1400s. Wari Empire, centered in the Peruvian highlands, controlled a vast territory from about 500 to 1000 AD. They built impressive stone cities, developed extensive road networks, and created elaborate textiles and ceramics. They also practiced cranial deformation, deliberately shaping children's skulls into elongated forms as a mark of status and cultural identity, which is one of those practices that makes modern people cringe, but was perfectly normal in context. After the Wari collapse around 1000 AD, regional cultures like the Chimu flourished on the Peruvian coast. The Chimu built Chan Chan, a massive adobe city that was the largest pre-Columbian city in South America, with a population of perhaps 30,000 people at its peak around 1400 AD. The city covered about 6 square miles and was divided into walled compounds containing palaces, storerooms, workshops, and temples. The walls were decorated with elaborate geometric friezes showing fish, birds, and other designs. The Chimu were master metalworkers, creating objects of gold, silver, copper, and bronze, using techniques like casting, hammering, soldering, and inlaying. They made elaborate ornaments, ceremonial knives, and functional tools. They developed complex irrigation systems that brought water from the Andes to coastal valleys, allowing intensive agriculture in one of the driest deserts on Earth. Some of these canals were over 50 miles long, requiring sophisticated engineering and constant maintenance. The Chimu worshipped the moon rather than the sun, unusual among Andean cultures. They believed the moon was more powerful than the sun because it could appear both day and night and controlled the tides and the growth of plants. Their kings claimed descent from the moon and staged elaborate ceremonies in its honor. When a king died, he was mummified and his palace was sealed, becoming a sacred place tended by servants and priests. The new king had to build his own palace, which drove constant construction and expansion. In the 1470s, the Inca Empire conquered the Chimu, incorporating their territory into what would become the largest empire in pre-Columbian America. But that's getting beyond our medieval focus and into the period right before European contact. So let's pull back. The point of this quick detour into South America is to emphasize that medieval America was a continent of civilizations. From the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego, people were building cities, developing technologies, creating art, and organizing complex societies. The scale and sophistication varied, but the basic pattern was universal. Human ingenuity, adapting to local environments, and creating cultures worth remembering. Now let's return north and talk about something we haven't covered yet: burial practices. Because one of the ways we know about these medieval American cultures is through what they left behind when people died. And some of these burial practices were elaborate and revealing. The Hopewell culture, which flourished in the Ohio River Valley from about 100 BC to 500 AD, so earlier than our medieval focus, but influential on later cultures, built elaborate burial mounds filled with exotic grave goods. These mounds contained copper ornaments from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, obsidian from the Rockies, shells from the Gulf Coast, and grizzly bear teeth from the Rockies. The quantity and quality of grave goods suggests significant social hierarchy and extensive trade networks. Some Hopewell burial mounds were enormous, covering several acres and rising 30 feet or more. Building one required moving thousands of tons of earth, basket by basket. The mounds often contained multiple burials, with some individuals receiving far more elaborate treatment than others. High-status individuals were cremated, and their ashes placed in log-lined tombs with massive quantities of grave goods. Lower-status individuals received simpler burials, if any at all. The Hopewell culture eventually declined, but their mound-building tradition influenced later cultures, including the Mississippians. The idea that important people deserved monumental burials, that their deaths required massive communal effort and sacrifice, persisted for over 1,000 years in eastern North America. Mississippian burials, as we discussed with Mound 72 at Cahokia, could include human sacrifice. But they also included elaborate grave goods showing the deceased's status and role. Chiefs and high-status individuals were buried with copper plates, shell beads, stone axes, elaborate pottery, and sometimes with symbols showing their connection to supernatural powers. The falcon dancer motif, showing a warrior with bird features, appears on objects buried with elite individuals, suggesting they held special religious or military roles. In the Southwest, ancestral Puebloan burials were typically simpler. Bodies were usually flexed into a fetal position and buried in pits, often beneath room floors or in trash middens. Grave goods were modest: pottery vessels, baskets, tools, jewelry. There's less evidence of dramatic social hierarchy in death, though some individuals did receive more goods than others. Hohokam cremated their dead, burning the bodies and placing the ashes in pottery jars, which were then buried. Cremation was the standard practice, cutting across all social levels. The cremated remains were sometimes accompanied by grave goods, but the emphasis was on the act of cremation itself, transforming the body through fire. This practice set the Hohokam apart from most other southwestern cultures. In the Arctic, Thule burials sometimes included grave goods like harpoons, knives, and other tools the deceased might need in the afterlife. Bodies were sometimes placed on platforms or in rock cairns rather than buried in the ground, which makes sense in a region where the ground is frozen much of the year. Some burials show evidence that people believed the dead continued to exist in some form and might need material objects. Northwest coast cultures placed high-status individuals in elaborate burial boxes, sometimes placed in trees or caves. The boxes were carved and painted and contained the deceased in a flexed position along with treasured possessions. Some groups practiced above-ground burial in mortuary poles, essentially totem poles with a compartment at the top containing the remains. Others used burial canoes, placing the deceased in a canoe that was then elevated on poles or placed in a cave. All of these burial practices tell us something about how these cultures understood death, status, and the afterlife. They also show the level of resources societies were willing to invest in honoring the dead. Building a massive burial mound, sacrificing dozens of people, or creating elaborate grave goods requires surplus labor and materials. It's a sign of social complexity and economic capacity. let's talk about warfare for a moment, because it's an aspect of medieval American cultures that sometimes gets downplayed in popular narratives. There's a tendency to romanticize pre-Columbian peoples as peaceful and harmonious, living in balance with nature. And while it's true that some of the stories about savage warfare were European propaganda, it's also true that violence was a real and persistent feature of life. Archaeological evidence for warfare in medieval America is abundant. We find fortifications, palisade walls around villages, defensive positions on hilltops, burned settlements. We find weapons, stone clubs, spear points, arrows designed for warfare rather than hunting. We find human remains showing evidence of violent death, skulls crushed by clubs, bodies pierced by arrows, people killed and left unburied. We find mass graves suggesting massacres. We find trophy taking, skulls separated from bodies, scalping marks on crania, bones worked into tools and ornaments. The Mississippian palisade at Cahokia suggests defense against attacks. The burned layers at many ancestral Puebloan sites show settlements destroyed by violence. The fortified hilltop villages in the Southwest suggest people were worried about raids. The warrior imagery in Southeastern ceremonial complex art shows that warfare was culturally significant, something worth commemorating and celebrating. Why did people fight? The usual reasons: competition over resources, particularly good farmland and water; revenge for previous attacks; raids for captives to replace population losses or to provide slaves; disputes over territory and trade routes; political conflicts between rival chiefs or factions; religious differences; personal insults and honor culture. All the same motivations that drove warfare everywhere else in the medieval world. Some violence was ritualized, governed by rules and customs. Northwest Coast raiding, for example, often focused on capturing high-status individuals for ransom or slaves for labor, rather than wholesale slaughter. Plains warfare before European contact often emphasized individual acts of bravery, counting coup by touching enemies, rather than killing as many people as possible. The violence had cultural meaning beyond simple destruction, but some violence was brutal and total. Massacres happened. Entire villages were wiped out. Enemies were tortured. Captives were enslaved or sacrificed. This wasn't noble or romantic. It was humans being terrible to each other, which is a universal feature of our species, regardless of time or place. Acknowledging this violence doesn't diminish indigenous cultures. It makes them fully human. People in medieval America dealt with the same challenges, moral dilemmas, and capacity for both cooperation and conflict as people everywhere. They weren't simple or one-dimensional. They were complex societies with all the contradictions that implies. Now let's talk about something more pleasant: art. Because medieval America produced some genuinely stunning artistic traditions that deserve far more recognition than they typically receive. Mississippian art, particularly the engraved shell gorgets and copper plates, shows extraordinary skill and sophistication. These objects, often only a few inches across, contain intricate designs with fine details. Artists used sharp stone or bone tools to incise lines into shell or hammer designs into copper, creating images of dancers, warriors, supernatural beings, and geometric patterns. The level of control required to create these delicate designs on hard materials is impressive. The imagery itself is symbolically complex. The falcon dancer, which appears repeatedly, combines human and bird features in ways that suggest transformation or spiritual power. The weeping eye motif, often surrounding by elaborate scrollwork, might represent tears, face paint, or perhaps both. The hand and eye symbol combines different sensory organs in a way that suggests heightened perception or supernatural sight. These aren't just decorative. They're communicating religious and political ideas through visual means. Ancestral Puebloan pottery from the medieval period shows geometric designs of extraordinary complexity and variety. Black on white pottery from the Chaco region features intricate patterns of lines, hatching, spirals, and abstract shapes arranged in balanced compositions. Each piece is unique, showing individual artistic vision within cultural conventions. Some vessels have thousands of painted lines, each one applied with precision and care. The rock art of the Southwest, including the pictographs and petroglyphs created by ancestral Puebloans and other groups, ranges from simple handprints to elaborate scenes showing hunting, ceremonies, supernatural beings, and astronomical events. Some sites have hundreds of images created over centuries, with earlier images overlaid by later ones, creating palimpsests of cultural memory. These images connected people to specific places, marked sacred sites, and recorded important events and visions. Hohokam artists created red on buff pottery with designs showing snakes, lizards, birds, humans, and complex geometric patterns. They etched designs into shells using fermented cactus juice, creating what might be the earliest example of acid etching in the world. They carved stone palettes with elaborate decorations, probably used for grinding pigments or other ceremonial substances. Their art shows clear influences from Mesoamerica, while also maintaining distinct Hohokam characteristics. Northwest coast art from the medieval period already showed the distinctive style that would reach its peak in later centuries. Bold, formline designs showing animals and supernatural beings with characteristic ovoid and U shapes, split representations showing both sides of bilateral symmetry at once, and complex compositions where figures nest within figures. This art appeared on totem poles, house posts, ceremonial masks, boxes, and woven textiles. It was an art tradition with clear rules and conventions, but also room for individual creativity and innovation. Thule art, carved from ivory and bone, shows hunting scenes, animals, and geometric designs with economy and elegance. Some pieces are tiny, amulets and ornaments a few centimeters across, carved with incredible detail. Others are larger, showing human figures in various activities or animals like seals, whales, and polar bears. The art served both aesthetic and spiritual purposes, with many pieces probably serving as hunting charms or representations of helping spirits. All of this art was functional in some way. It wasn't art for art's sake. It served religious, political, social, or practical purposes. But that doesn't diminish its aesthetic value. The artists who created these objects had skill, vision, and cultural knowledge that allowed them to produce works of genuine beauty. These objects deserve to be in the same conversations as medieval European art, Japanese ink paintings, or any other artistic tradition from the period. Let's talk about astronomy for a bit, because one of the more impressive aspects of medieval American cultures was their careful observation of celestial phenomena and their ability to track time with precision. We've already mentioned the woodhenge at Cahokia, aligned to mark solstices and equinoxes, but astronomical knowledge was widespread across medieval America. The ancestral pueblones at Chaco Canyon aligned their buildings to solar and lunar events. The great house called Pueblo Bonito is oriented along a north-south axis. The walls of several buildings align with solstice sunrises and sunsets. The great kivas, the large ceremonial rooms, have orientations that mark specific astronomical events. The Chacones also created the Sundagger site at Fajada Butte, where slabs of rock create patterns of light and shadow across spiral petroglyphs carved into the cliff face. At the summer solstice, a dagger of light pierces the center of the larger spiral. At the winter solstice, 2 daggers of light bracket the spiral. At the equinoxes, a smaller dagger bisects the smaller spiral. This wasn't accidental. Someone carefully positioned those rock slabs to create these effects, using the natural landscape as a giant astronomical instrument. Why care about solstices and equinoxes? Because agriculture depends on timing. You need to know when to plant, when to harvest, when to expect frost. In a marginal environment like the Southwest, where the growing season is short and water is scarce, getting the timing wrong could mean starvation. Astronomical observations provided a reliable calendar, allowing people to coordinate agricultural activities and ceremonial events with seasonal changes. The Hohokam also tracked astronomical events. At a site called Casa Grande in Arizona, the main structure has openings that align with the sun at specific times of year. The building itself might have served as an astronomical observatory, allowing priests or specialists to track the solar year and determine when to plant crops or hold ceremonies. The Hohokam agricultural system, dependent on carefully managed irrigation, required precise timing. You couldn't just open the canal gates whenever you felt like it. You needed to coordinate water distribution with crop needs and seasonal patterns. The Maya, just south of our primary focus, but worth mentioning because their astronomical knowledge was extraordinary, developed one of the most accurate calendar systems in the ancient world. They tracked the movements of Venus with precision, recorded eclipses, and made calculations extending thousands of years into the future and past. Their Dresden Codex, one of the few Maya books to survive Spanish destruction, contains detailed astronomical tables predicting Venus cycles, eclipse possibilities, and other celestial events. The Maya weren't unique in this obsession with the sky. They were just particularly good at it and had a writing system to record their observations. But cultures across the Americas were watching the heavens, tracking patterns, and using that knowledge to organize their societies and understand their place in the cosmos. The Mississippians oriented their mound complexes to cardinal directions and astronomical events. The central axis at Cahokia runs precisely north-south. Other Mississippian sites show similar precision in their layouts. This wasn't just aesthetics. It was a statement about cosmic order, about aligning human settlements with the fundamental structure of the universe. The built environment reflected and reinforced religious cosmology. In the Arctic, the Thule tracked the sun's position to navigate and to know when seasons were changing. In a place where winter darkness lasts for months and summer light is constant, conventional timekeeping doesn't work. You need to pay attention to the sun's position, the stars, the moon phases, and environmental cues like ice conditions and animal migrations. Thule astronomical knowledge was practical, oriented toward survival and navigation rather than calendrical precision, but no less sophisticated for that. The peoples of the plains tracked star patterns to navigate and to determine when buffalo would migrate. The Skiddy Pawnee, who lived in what's now Nebraska and developed much of their culture in the post-medieval period, but drew on older traditions, had elaborate astronomical knowledge. They associated stars and constellations with specific gods and spirits. They organized their villages and ceremonial lodges to reflect stellar patterns. Morning star and evening star were central figures in their cosmology, and the timing of ceremonies was coordinated with celestial events. All of this astronomical knowledge was embedded in religious and ceremonial contexts. The sky wasn't just a clock or a navigational aid. It was sacred, populated by spiritual beings, governed by cosmic laws that also governed human society. Observing the sky was a religious act. Aligning buildings to celestial events was a way of participating in cosmic order. The calendar wasn't just practical. It was a way of synchronizing human time with sacred time. This is something modern people often have trouble grasping. For medieval American cultures, there wasn't a sharp distinction between practical and sacred, between science and religion. Astronomy was both. It helped you plant corn, and it connected you to the gods. Architecture was both shelter and cosmology. Time was both seasonal cycles and sacred narrative. Everything was integrated into a holistic worldview where physical and spiritual realities were inseparable. Let's shift gears and talk about something we haven't addressed much yet: languages. Because medieval America was linguistically diverse in ways that are hard to imagine. North America alone had over 300 distinct languages before European contact, belonging to dozens of language families with no apparent relationship to each other. You had Algonquian languages spread across the Northeast and Great Lakes, Iroquoian languages in the Northeast and Southeast, Muskogean languages in the Southeast, Siouan languages across the plains and into the Southeast, Caddoan languages on the southern plains, Uto-Aztecan languages from the Great Basin through the Southwest into Mexico, Athabascan languages in the subarctic, the Southwest, and the Pacific coast, Salishan, Wakashan, and Tsimshianic languages on the Northwest coast, Eskimo Aleut languages across the Arctic. Within each language family were dozens of individual languages, often mutually unintelligible. A Mohawk speaker from upstate New York couldn't understand a Cherokee speaker from the Carolinas, even though both spoke Iroquoian languages. A Lakota speaker from the plains couldn't understand a Catawba speaker from South Carolina, even though both spoke Siouan languages. The linguistic diversity was staggering. This diversity tells us something important. These weren't recent arrivals to the continent. People had been here for thousands of years, long enough for languages to diverge and evolve into distinct families with no obvious connections. The linguistic evidence supports the archaeological evidence. North America during the medieval period was home to peoples with deep roots and long histories. Languages weren't static. They changed over time, borrowed words from each other, and evolved in response to social and environmental changes. Trade languages and lingua francas developed in areas where different groups needed to communicate. Sign language was used across the plains, allowing speakers of different languages to communicate through standardized gestures. This wasn't primitive gesturing. This was a sophisticated visual language with grammar and syntax, capable of expressing complex ideas. Some cultures developed memory systems that, while not writing in the conventional sense, allowed them to preserve information across generations. The Inca had quipu, knotted strings that encoded numerical and possibly narrative information. The Ojibwe and other Great Lakes peoples used birchbark scrolls with pictographic symbols to record religious teachings and historical events. The Mississippians might have used similar systems, though if so, they haven't survived. The absence of writing in most medieval American cultures doesn't mean they had no way of preserving knowledge. Oral traditions, especially when formalized and embedded in ceremonial contexts, can be remarkably stable across generations. Information was encoded in stories, songs, ritual performances, and material objects. Wampum belts, shell beads woven into patterns, served as mnemonic devices for Iroquoian peoples, helping orators remember treaty terms and historical events. The patterns didn't write the information in the way alphabetic writing does, but they triggered trained memories, allowing accurate recall of complex information. The point is that absence of writing doesn't equal absence of history or intellectual sophistication. Medieval American cultures had rich oral traditions, complex knowledge systems, and and ways of preserving and transmitting information that didn't depend on written texts. We've lost much of that knowledge because oral traditions are fragile, easily disrupted by demographic catastrophes like the disease epidemics that followed European contact. But what survives, preserved in indigenous communities and recorded by early ethnographers, shows intellectual depth and cultural richness that deserves recognition. Now let's talk about food and agriculture in a bit more depth. Because the agricultural achievements of medieval American cultures were genuinely impressive and had global impacts that are still felt today. The domestication of corn, or maize, was one of the most significant agricultural developments in human history. Corn was domesticated from a wild grass called teosinte in Mexico around 9,000 years ago. Teosinte looks nothing like modern corn. It has tiny ears with a handful of hard seeds. Over thousands of years of selective breeding, indigenous farmers transformed this unpromising plant into one of the world's most productive crops. By the medieval period, corn had been bred into hundreds of varieties adapted to different climates and conditions. There were varieties for high altitudes and low altitudes, dry regions and wet regions, short growing seasons and long growing seasons. There were varieties optimized for grinding into flour, varieties that popped when heated, varieties with different colors and flavors. This wasn't accidental. This was deliberate plant breeding carried out over millennia by farmers who understood heredity and selection. The same was true for beans, squash, potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, cacao, and dozens of other crops. The indigenous peoples of the Americas domesticated more plant species than any other region of the world. Potatoes alone, domesticated in the Andes, have hundreds of traditional varieties, each adapted to specific microclimates and altitudes. The agricultural knowledge required to develop and maintain this diversity was extraordinary. The Three Sisters agricultural system, which we've mentioned several times, was an elegant example of companion planting. Corn provides a stalk for beans to climb. Beans fix nitrogen in the soil, fertilizing the corn and squash. Squash spreads along the ground, shading out weeds and retaining soil moisture. Together, the three crops provide complementary nutrients. Corn supplies carbohydrates, beans provide protein, and squash offers vitamins and minerals. It's a nutritionally balanced diet grown in an ecologically sustainable system. This wasn't something discovered by accident. It was developed through generations of experimentation and observation. Farmers noticed that certain crops grew better together. They tested different combinations. They selected seeds from the best performing plants. They shared knowledge across communities. Over time, they created an agricultural system that supported large populations without exhausting the soil. The Hohokam irrigation systems we discussed earlier represent another agricultural achievement. Bringing water across miles of desert to fields, managing flow rates, preventing erosion and salt buildup, coordinating water distribution among multiple communities. This required engineering knowledge, organizational capacity, and sophisticated understanding of hydrology and soil science. The ancestral Puebloans developed agricultural techniques adapted to the dry Southwest. They built check dams to slow runoff and capture water. They terraced hillsides to create level planting surfaces and reduce erosion. They planted in areas where water naturally collected. They developed drought-resistant varieties of corn that could mature in 90 days or less, allowing them to farm at high altitudes with short growing seasons. Every technique represented accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. In the eastern woodlands, farmers developed mound agriculture in wet areas, building raised fields that provided drainage while enriching the soil with organic matter. In the swampy regions around the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River Valley, these raised fields allowed cultivation of crops that would have rotted in waterlogged soil. The earthworks weren't just ceremonial. Many served practical agricultural functions. The agricultural surplus produced by these systems supported the complex societies we've been discussing. You can't build Cahokia if everyone is constantly scrambling for food. You can't have specialized craftspeople, priests, and chiefs if all labor is devoted to subsistence. Agricultural productivity creates surplus, and surplus allows social complexity. The mound builders, the ancestral Puebloans, the Mississippians, all depended on farming systems that reliably produced more food than the farmers themselves needed. And when European colonists arrived and saw these agricultural systems, many of them didn't recognize what they were looking at. They saw wilderness and savage peoples living in nature, not recognizing that the landscape had been deliberately shaped by generations of agricultural practice. The forests of the eastern woodlands were managed ecosystems, thinned by controlled burning to promote the growth of nut trees and browse for deer. The grasslands of the plains were maintained by fire to prevent woody plants from encroaching. The natural abundance that impressed early European observers was often the product of careful human management. This is important because the myth of the pristine wilderness, the idea that the Americas before Columbus were untouched nature, is both historically inaccurate and politically consequential. It erases indigenous agency and accomplishment. It suggests that the land was empty and unused, available for European taking. The reality is that the Americas were home to millions of people who had been actively shaping their environments for thousands of years. Let's talk about trade goods in more specific detail, because the items that moved through medieval American trade networks tell fascinating stories about what people valued and how far they were willing to go to get it. Copper from the Great Lakes region was one of the most widely traded materials. The native copper deposits around Lake Superior are some of the richest in the world, and indigenous peoples were mining them for thousands of years before the medieval period. They used stone tools to pry copper nuggets from rock, heated the copper to make it more workable, and hammered it into shape. Copper was made into tools, weapons, and ornaments. It was valued for its beauty, its malleability, and probably its perceived spiritual properties. Copper objects from the Great Lakes have been found in burial sites throughout the eastern woodlands and into the southeast and plains. A copper gorget made near Lake Superior might be worn by a chief in Georgia or buried with a warrior in Oklahoma. The copper traveled through multiple hands, traded from community to community, accruing value and significance as it moved. Shells from the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic coast were another major trade item. Marine shells were fashioned into beads, gorgets, cups, and other objects. The spiral shells of marine conchs were particularly valued. Shell workers developed techniques for cutting, grinding, and polishing shell into desired forms. Some shells were engraved with intricate designs. Others were worked into beads that served as currency or were woven into wampum belts. Obsidian, volcanic glass from the Rocky Mountains and the Southwest, was valued for its sharp edges. A well-made obsidian blade could be sharper than modern surgical steel. Obsidian was worked into arrowheads, knives, and ceremonial blades. It also served as a prestige item, displayed and traded as a symbol of wealth and connections. Obsidian from sources in Yellowstone has been found in Ohio. Obsidian from New Mexico has been found in Texas and Oklahoma. People wanted this stuff and were willing to trade for it. Turquoise from mines in the Southwest was worked into beads, pendants, and inlay decorations. Turquoise jewelry has been found at sites across the Southwest and into Mesoamerica. The blue-green stone was valued for its beauty and its perceived spiritual properties. Turquoise mining required significant labor, digging into hillsides and extracting the veins of blue-green stone from the surrounding rock. But the demand was strong enough to justify the effort. Mica from the Appalachians was split into thin sheets and cut into elaborate shapes. Some Hopewell burials contained mica cutouts showing hands, birds, and other figures. These fragile objects required careful handling and had no obvious practical use. They were purely ceremonial or prestige items, valued for their shimmering beauty and the skill required to create them. Exotic bird feathers, particularly from tropical species like scarlet macaws and parrots, were highly valued across the Southwest. We've mentioned that Pacoima might have bred macaws specifically for the feather trade. Macaw feathers appeared in burials and ritual contexts at sites from Chaco Canyon to Hohokam villages. Getting these feathers required either long-distance trade with Mesoamerica or actually transporting live birds to the Southwest and breeding them, which the people at Pacoima apparently did. That's a remarkable investment of resources for decorative feathers. All of these trade items moved through networks that connected communities across thousands of miles. The networks weren't controlled by any single political authority. They were the cumulative result of countless individual exchanges, community relationships, and the universal human desire for stuff you don't have. Trade created connections, dependencies, and conflicts. It spread ideas along with goods. It created shared cultural elements across vast regions, while also maintaining local distinctiveness. Now, let's address something that often gets glossed over in discussions of pre-Columbian America: environmental modification and ecological impacts. Because indigenous peoples weren't living in perfect harmony with nature, leaving no trace, they were modifying their environments in significant ways, sometimes with problematic consequences. The deforestation around Chaco Canyon is a clear example. Building the great houses required an estimated 200,000 wooden beams. Those trees came from forests 50 to 70 miles away because the local environment had been stripped of timber. Cutting down that many trees had ecological consequences. It caused erosion, reduced wildlife habitat, and changed local climate patterns. The environmental degradation around Chaco might have contributed to the site's eventual abandonment. Cahokia probably experienced similar problems. Supporting a population of 10,000 to 20,000 people in a concentrated area requires a lot of resources. Wood for construction and fuel would have depleted local forests. Agricultural intensification could have led to soil exhaustion. Waste disposal in a pre-modern city of that size creates sanitation problems. There's evidence that environmental degradation and resource depletion played a role in Cahokia's decline. The Hohokam irrigation systems, while impressive, eventually faced problems with salt buildup. When you irrigate in a desert, salts from the soil accumulate in the fields as water evaporates. Over time, this can make the soil too salty to grow crops. The Hohokam tried to manage this by periodically abandoning fields and opening new ones, but eventually the usable land ran out. Salt buildup might have been a factor in the transformation of Hohokam society in the 1400s. The ancestral Puebloans' intensive farming in marginal environments probably contributed to environmental stress. Clearing vegetation for fields, cutting wood for fuel and construction, concentrating population in specific areas, all had ecological impacts. When droughts hit, these impacts made recovery more difficult. Degraded landscapes are less resilient to climate stress. None of this is meant as criticism. Medieval Europeans were doing the same things, often worse. Deforestation, soil exhaustion, and urban sanitation problems were universal challenges for pre-modern societies. The point is that indigenous Americans were fully engaged with their environments, modifying them to suit human needs, sometimes successfully and sustainably, sometimes not. The myth of the ecological Indian, living in perfect harmony with nature, is both patronizing and inaccurate. It treats indigenous peoples as something other than fully human, as noble savages lacking the capacity for environmental destruction. The reality is more complex and more interesting. Indigenous peoples were developing agricultural and technological systems that often were more sustainable than European practices. But they also made mistakes, faced trade-offs, and dealt with the consequences of environmental modification. Understanding this makes their achievements more impressive, not less. They were solving genuinely difficult problems, managing complex ecosystems, adapting to environmental changes, and doing so with technologies and knowledge systems developed over millennia of lived experience. Let's shift our focus now and talk about what daily life might have been like in these medieval American societies, because it's easy to get caught up in discussing mounds and trade networks and lose sight of the fact that real people were living real lives in these places. At Cahokia, during its peak in the 1100s, most people lived in small rectangular houses with thatched roofs and walls made of wattle and daub, basically woven branches covered with mud plaster. These houses were arranged in neighborhoods around the central ceremonial complex. A typical house might be 12 by 15 feet, providing shelter for a family of 4 to 6 people. Not spacious by modern standards, but adequate. Inside, there would be a central hearth for cooking and warmth, sleeping platforms along the walls, storage pits dug into the floor for keeping corn, beans, and other foods, tools hanging from the walls or stored in baskets, pottery vessels for cooking and storage, maybe a few prized possessions, a shell bead necklace, a well-made stone tool, a carved figurine. Most possessions were functional. Purely decorative items were luxuries for the elite. Daily life revolved around agricultural work during the growing season, planting corn in spring, tending the crops through summer, harvesting in fall, processing the harvest, drying corn, shelling beans, storing everything for winter, making and repairing tools, collecting firewood, hauling water, cooking. All the endless tasks required to maintain a household without modern conveniences. But there was also community life, gatherings in the plazas for ceremonies and rituals, ball games, which were probably both religious ceremonies and entertainment, markets where people traded goods and caught up on gossip, work parties where neighbors helped each other with big projects like building houses or processing large harvests, social visits, storytelling, music, dancing. Life wasn't all grinding labor. There were moments of joy, celebration, and community. The elite lived differently, of course. They occupied larger houses, possibly on the mounds themselves, or in special compounds. They had more possessions, fancier clothing, better food. They didn't spend their days in the fields. They had religious duties, administrative responsibilities, and political roles. They mediated disputes, organized ceremonies, managed trade relationships, and made decisions about when to plant and when to harvest based on astronomical observations and ritual calendars. The inequality was real and probably significant. Elite burials at Cahokia contain far more grave goods than commoner burials. The elite literally lived above everyone else, on top of the mounds. They had the power to command labor for mound construction and to demand tribute in the form of food and goods. This was a hierarchical society with clear class distinctions. But the system also had obligations running both ways. Elites were expected to be generous, to redistribute wealth, to host feasts, to provide for the community in times of need. Chief who hoarded resources without giving back would lose legitimacy and support. The social contract required reciprocity. even if it wasn't equal reciprocity. In an ancestral Puebloan community at Mesa Verde in the 1200s, daily life was similarly centered on agriculture, but with adaptations to the Southwest environment. People rose early before the heat of the day. Women ground corn on stone metates, the sound of stone on stone providing a rhythmic background to village life. The fine flour would be made into thin corn cakes cooked on hot stones. Men worked in the fields down in the canyon bottoms, tending corn, beans, and squash. They also hunted, going out for days at a time tracking deer, rabbits, and other game. Women gathered wild plant foods, knowing which plants were edible, which had medicinal properties, which could be used for dyes or basketry materials. This knowledge was extensive, accumulated over generations, passed from mothers to daughters. Children helped with age-appropriate tasks. Young children scared birds away from crops. Older children helped with planting and harvesting. Teenagers began learning specialized skills, boys learning to hunt and make tools, girls learning to weave baskets and make pottery. But there was also time for play, for swimming in the canyon streams, for games and stories. Pottery making was a specialized skill, but also a common one. Most women knew how to make basic pottery for everyday use. The process was time-consuming. You had to find the right clay, remove impurities, mix it with temper to prevent cracking, coil it into shape, smooth the surfaces, paint designs if desired, and then fire it in an open pit fire with carefully controlled temperature. A single pot might represent days of work. Weaving was another important skill. Cotton was grown and woven into cloth for clothing and blankets. Yucca fibers were processed and woven into sandals. Strips of rabbit fur were twisted around yucca cord and woven into warm blankets. Baskets were woven in various sizes and patterns for different uses. Large baskets for storage, small baskets for gathering seeds, tightly woven baskets for holding water. Social life in Puebloan communities centered on the kiva, the underground ceremonial chamber. Men's societies met there for rituals, discussions, and social gatherings. Women had their own gathering spaces and ceremonies. The division of labor and social life along gender lines was significant, but it's important not to assume this meant inequality. Women in Puebloan societies owned the houses and controlled household resources. Descent was matrilineal. Women had substantial power and authority. In a Hohokam village along the Gila River in the 1100s, life revolved around the irrigation canals. Managing water was a community effort requiring coordination and cooperation. Canal maintenance was constant work. Silt had to be cleared, breaches repaired, flow rates adjusted. This work was probably organized by water associations or canal managers who coordinated labor and resolved disputes over water distribution. The Hohokam played their ball game on the large earthen courts that were central features of their settlements. We don't know the exact rules, but it probably involved keeping a rubber ball in motion using hips and shoulders, similar to Mesoamerican ball games. The game was likely both sport and ritual, with religious significance and social importance. Winners gained prestige. Losers faced shame. Spectators gambled on the outcome. Hohokam craftspeople specialized in shell working, pottery making, and stone tool production. A shell worker might spend hours carefully grinding and polishing a shell into a bracelet, using stone abraders and sand to slowly shape the hard material. The finished product would be traded, possibly traveling hundreds of miles to someone who would wear it as a prized possession, a connection to distant places and peoples. In a Thule winter house on the Arctic coast around 1300 AD, life was focused on surviving the cold and dark. The house, semi-subterranean with walls of sod and a roof of whale bones covered with skins, provided shelter from temperatures that could drop to -40 or colder. Inside, a seal oil lamp provided heat and light. The lamp was tended constantly, usually by women, using rendered seal blubber as fuel. The light was dim, the space smoky, but it was warm enough to survive. Winter was a time for storytelling, tool-making, and repairing equipment. Men carved new harpoon heads from walrus ivory, attached sinew lines, prepared floats for the spring hunting season. Women sewed new clothing, using caribou hide for warmth and seal skin for waterproofing. They used bone needles and sinew thread, stitching with remarkable precision to create garments that could keep you alive in the harshest environment on Earth. Food in winter came from stores accumulated during summer and fall. Dried fish, seal meat preserved in oil, frozen caribou. People ate high-fat diets because you need lots of calories to stay warm in the Arctic. Sharing was essential. A successful hunter distributed meat throughout the community. Someone who hoarded food faced social sanctions and might find themselves without help when they needed it. Survival depended on reciprocity. Spring brought the return of light and the migration of sea mammals. The entire community would mobilize for the hunt. Men went out in kayaks or on the sea ice with their harpoons. Women and children waited on shore to help butcher and process the catch. A successful seal hunt meant food, fuel, and materials for the coming year. An unsuccessful season meant hunger and hardship. On the northwest coast, in an aqua village around 1400 AD, life revolved around salmon. The salmon runs in summer were the most important events of the year. The entire community came together to catch, process, and preserve thousands of fish. Men used nets, weirs, and spears to catch salmon in the rivers. Women split and dried the fish, hanging them on racks in the smoky air to preserve them for winter. The first salmon of the season was greeted with ceremony. It was treated with respect. Its bones returned to the river, so the salmon's spirits would return next year. This wasn't superstition. It was a conservation ethic embedded in religious practice. Respect the salmon. Don't take more than you need. Ensure the runs continue. It worked for thousands of years. Winter was potlatch season, when chiefs hosted feasts that could last for days. Guests arrived by canoe from neighboring villages, wearing their finest regalia. The host chief distributed gifts, demonstrated his wealth and generosity, and reinforced his status. Guests reciprocated with their own potlatches, creating cycles of gift, giving, and obligation that bound communities together. The plank houses where people lived were impressive structures. A large house might be 40 by 60 feet, with walls made of cedar planks and a roof of more planks or cedar bark. The interior had raised platforms along the walls where families slept, separated by hanging mats for privacy. Multiple families, related through kinship, lived together in one house. The central area had fire pits for cooking and gathering. Slaves, captured in raids or born into slavery, did much of the hard labor. They hauled water, collected firewood, processed fish, and worked on construction projects. Their status was inherited and permanent. They had no rights and could be bought, sold, or killed at their owner's discretion. It's an uncomfortable reality that hierarchical Northwest coast societies were built in part on enslaved labor. In all of these societies, social life was governed by kinship obligations, ritual calendars, and seasonal rhythms. People knew their relatives, their responsibilities, their place in the social order. Life had structure and meaning provided by cultural traditions that stretched back generations. There was less individual freedom than modern people might prefer, but also less isolation and uncertainty. You knew who you were, where you belonged, and what was expected of you. Religion permeated daily life. There wasn't a separation between sacred and secular. Planting corn was a sacred act. Hunting required ritual preparation. Pottery designs incorporated religious symbols. Stories told around the fire transmitted moral teachings and cosmological knowledge. Everything was connected to a larger spiritual reality. Shamans, medicine people, and priests served as intermediaries between the human and spiritual worlds. They conducted healing ceremonies, performed divinations, communicated with spirits, and ensured that proper rituals were observed. Their knowledge was specialized, often acquired through visions or long apprenticeships. They had power and status, but also responsibilities. A shaman who couldn't cure illness or a priest whose ceremonies failed to bring rain would lose credibility and authority. Healthcare was a combination of empirical medicine and spiritual healing. People knew which plants had medicinal properties. Willow bark for pain, echinacea for infections, various plants for digestive problems, fever, and other ailments. Some of this knowledge was genuinely effective. Modern pharmaceutical companies have derived drugs from plants that indigenous peoples used for centuries. But illness was also understood in spiritual terms. Sickness might be caused by witchcraft, by offending spirits, by breaking taboos, by losing one's soul. Treatment required both physical remedies and spiritual interventions. A healing ceremony might involve herbal medicines, ritual purification, songs and prayers, and offerings to spirits. From a modern medical perspective, some of this was therapeutic placebo effect and the healing power of community support. But from the perspective of medieval American peoples, it was a comprehensive approach to health that addressed both body and spirit. Death was understood as a transition, not an ending. The dead went to another world, but they remained connected to the living. Ancestors watched over their descendants, intervened in human affairs and expected proper respect and offerings. Funerary rituals ensured the dead reached the afterlife and maintained good relations with the living. Ghosts of people who died badly or weren't properly buried could cause problems for the living, so proper funeral rites were essential. Childhood in these societies was different from modern childhood. Children were expected to contribute to household labor from an early age. They learned by watching and imitating adults. Formal schooling didn't exist, but education was ongoing and comprehensive. You learned the skills you needed to survive and the cultural knowledge that made you a full member of the community. Puberty was marked by ceremonies that initiated young people into adult status. Girls' first menstruation was often celebrated with rituals that acknowledged their transition to womanhood and fertility. Boys underwent vision quests, fasting, or tests of endurance that proved their readiness for adult responsibilities. These weren't just symbolic rituals. They were transformative experiences that shaped identity and social role. Marriage customs varied across cultures, but generally involved negotiations between families, exchange of gifts or bride price, and ceremonies that established the new relationship. In many societies, marriage created alliances between families and communities, serving political and economic functions beyond the personal relationship between spouses. Divorce was possible in most societies, though the ease and consequences varied. In matrilineal societies where women owned the houses, a woman could divorce her husband by simply placing his belongings outside the door. In patrilineal societies where men controlled property, divorce was more difficult for women. But in general, marriages that weren't working could be dissolved, and people could remarry. Polygamy was practiced in some societies, usually with wealthy or high-status men having multiple wives. This wasn't universal, and in many communities, monogamy was the norm. But where polygamy existed, it created complex family dynamics. Multiple wives might be sisters, which helped maintain family harmony, or they might be rivals competing for their husband's attention and resources. Same-sex relationships existed and were acknowledged in various ways across different cultures. Some societies had third or fourth gender categories for people who didn't fit binary male-female roles. These individuals often had special spiritual status and specific social roles. The acceptance and integration of gender diversity varied, but it was present in many pre-Columbian societies, which is worth noting given modern debates about gender and sexuality. Let's talk about conflict resolution, because every society needs ways to handle disputes without everything descending into violence. In many medieval American societies, councils of elders or chiefs mediated disputes. If two people had a conflict, they could bring it before the council, which would hear both sides and render judgment. The judgment might involve compensation, public apology, or ritual purification. Some societies used duels or contests to settle disputes. Among some plains groups, rivals might compete in games or races, with the winner gaining prestige and the loser accepting defeat. This channeled competitive aggression into socially acceptable forms. Witchcraft accusations were a common way that social tensions manifested. If someone was persistently unlucky, if crops failed, if children died, witchcraft might be suspected. Accused witches faced social ostracism, forced confession, or even execution. Witchcraft beliefs, while from a modern perspective irrational, served social functions. They explained misfortune, identified scapegoats, and allowed communities to expel troublesome members. Blood feuds were a persistent problem in societies without strong central authority. If someone from one clan killed someone from another clan, the victim's relatives might seek revenge, leading to cycles of retaliatory violence. Some societies developed elaborate compensation systems to prevent feuds. A killing could be settled with payment of goods, or the transfer of a person from the killer's family to the victim's family. These settlements weren't always successful, but they represented attempts to resolve conflicts without endless violence. Now let's talk about something we haven't addressed much: humor and entertainment. Because life wasn't all grim survival and religious ritual. People joked, played games, told funny stories, and entertained each other. Games were common across medieval American societies. Dice games using marked stones or bones, guessing games, races, wrestling, stick games where you had to guess which hand held an object. These games often involved gambling, with people betting food, tools, or other possessions on the outcome. Gambling could be excessive, with people losing everything they owned. Some societies tried to regulate gambling to prevent social problems. Storytelling was a major form of entertainment. Long winter nights were passed telling stories about culture heroes, trickster figures, creation myths, historical events, and moral lessons. Good storytellers were valued, able to hold an audience's attention for hours with their narratives. Some stories were sacred and could only be told at specific times or by specific people. Others were common entertainment, adaptable and variable. Music and dance were central to ceremonies and social gatherings. Drums, rattles, flutes, and whistles provided rhythm and melody. Songs had specific purposes: healing songs, war songs, love songs, mourning songs. Dance was a communal activity, bringing people together in coordinated movement that reinforced social bonds and expressed cultural identity. Jokes and teasing were part of daily interaction. People made fun of each other's mistakes, told ribald stories, and engaged in wordplay. Some societies had formal clowning traditions where certain individuals were permitted to mock authority figures and violate social norms during ceremonies. These sacred clowns served important functions, providing social commentary and reminding people not to take themselves too seriously. Art and decoration brightened daily life. Pottery wasn't just functional, it was decorated with beautiful designs. Clothing featured decorative elements. People painted their faces and bodies for ceremonies and social occasions. Houses might have painted designs or carved posts. The aesthetic impulse, the desire to make things beautiful, was universal. All of this gives us a picture of medieval American societies as fully human, complex, and dynamic. People lived, worked, loved, fought, celebrated, mourned, and passed their days in communities bound by kinship, tradition, and shared culture. They weren't radically different from people anywhere else in the medieval world. They faced similar challenges and developed similar solutions. They created meaning, beauty, and order in their lives. They deserve to be remembered not as footnotes or curiosities, but as full participants in human history. As we drift toward the end of our journey through medieval America, we need to talk about what happened as that period came to a close. Because the transition from the medieval period to the early modern period in the Americas was marked by catastrophe on a scale almost unprecedented in human history. European contact, which began with Norse visits to Newfoundland around 1000 AD, and Columbus's voyages in the 1490s, brought diseases to which indigenous Americans had no immunity. Smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, and other pathogens spread through populations that had never encountered them. The death toll was staggering. Estimates vary, but most scholars now believe that the indigenous population of the Americas declined by 50 to 90% in the first century or two after sustained European contact. Some regions were hit harder than others. The Caribbean was virtually depopulated. The densely populated areas of Mexico and Peru suffered catastrophic losses. North America, with generally lower population density, had somewhat better survival rates, but still experienced devastating epidemics. This wasn't just a demographic catastrophe. It was a cultural catastrophe. When 70 or 80% of your population dies in a few decades, social institutions collapse. Agricultural systems break down. Trade networks dissolve. Religious specialists and knowledge keepers die, taking their knowledge with them. Young people grow up without elders to teach them traditional practices. Communities that had existed for centuries simply cease to exist. The timing was particularly brutal because many areas were already experiencing stress from climate change and environmental degradation. The Little Ice Age, which began around 1300 to 1400, brought cooler temperatures and more erratic weather. Agricultural systems that had been sustainable became marginal. Populations that were already declining or reorganizing were then hit by introduced diseases. The double blow of climate stress and epidemic disease was overwhelming. Some societies managed to maintain continuity despite massive population loss. The Puebloan communities, for example, survived multiple waves of epidemic disease and Spanish colonization. They retreated to defensive positions, reorganized their communities, and maintained core cultural practices. When Spanish colonizers tried to suppress Puebloan religion in the 1600s, the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 drove the Spanish out of New Mexico for 12 years. The Puebloans demonstrated remarkable resilience and cultural persistence, but many societies weren't so fortunate. The Mississippian culture, already declining before European contact, collapsed completely in the 1500s and 1600s. The great mound centers were abandoned. The elaborate ceremonial complex disappeared. Descendants of the Mississippians reorganized into confederacies like the Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw. But the specific cultural forms of the Mississippian period were lost. The Hohokam transformation in the 1400s, which we discussed earlier, might have been influenced by early disease introduction even before direct European contact. Diseases can spread through trade networks faster than the people carrying them, so it's possible that epidemics reached the Southwest before Europeans did. Or it might have been entirely due to local environmental and social factors. We don't know for certain. What we do know is that by the time European colonizers arrived in most of North America, they were seeing a landscape already transformed by catastrophe. The populations were smaller than they had been a century or two earlier. Political organizations had changed. Settlement patterns had shifted, and Europeans interpreted what they saw as evidence that indigenous peoples had always been sparse and primitive, never realizing they were looking at the aftermath of apocalypse. This misinterpretation had lasting consequences. It shaped European attitudes toward indigenous peoples and their rights to the land. It influenced American mythology about the frontier and manifest destiny. It erased the achievements of medieval American civilizations from popular consciousness. And it persists today in subtle ways, in the assumption that North America was sparsely populated before European arrival, that indigenous peoples didn't significantly modify their environments, that complex civilization was something Europeans brought to the continent. None of that is true. Medieval America was home to millions of people living in sophisticated societies. They built cities, developed technologies, created art, and shaped their environments. They had histories as long and complex as any European nation. They deserve to be remembered on their own terms, not as victims or footnotes, but as participants in the great story of human civilization. And their descendants are still here. The Pueblo peoples, the Oadam and Akimel-Oadam, the Iroquois nations, the Inuit and Yupik, the tribes of the Northwest Coast, the peoples of the plains and the eastern woodlands, Caribbean communities maintaining Taino identity, hundreds of indigenous nations across the Americas, each with their own languages, cultures, and histories stretching back thousands of years. These communities have survived colonization, genocide, forced assimilation, and ongoing discrimination. They've maintained cultural traditions, fought for their rights, and worked to revive languages and practices that were nearly lost. They're the living connection to the medieval American civilizations we've been discussing. Their presence is proof that these cultures didn't disappear. They transformed, adapted, and persisted. Understanding medieval America isn't just an academic exercise. It's a way of honoring the full history of this continent and the people who have called it home for millennia. It's a corrective to narratives that begin American history in 1492 or 1607, erasing everything that came before. It's recognition that civilization, achievement, and historical significance aren't the exclusive property of Europeans. The cities of medieval America weren't as grand as Paris or Constantinople, but Cahokia was larger than London. The agricultural systems weren't as intensive as Chinese rice paddies, but the Three Sisters system was sustainable and nutritionally sophisticated. The art wasn't the same as Renaissance painting, but Mississippian copper plates and Northwest coast carvings were technically skilled and aesthetically powerful. The astronomical knowledge wasn't preserved in written treatises, but Chacones tracked solstices and equinoxes with precision. Different isn't lesser. Medieval American civilizations developed their own solutions to universal human challenges. They created their own forms of beauty, meaning, and social organization. They deserve to be studied, appreciated, and remembered not as curiosities, but as full expressions of human cultural potential. As we come to the end of this long night's journey, I hope you've gained some appreciation for the complexity and diversity of medieval America. We've covered a lot of ground, from the mound builders of Cahokia to the Thule hunters of the Arctic, from the ancestral Pueblones of the Southwest to the island Caribs of the Lesser Antilles. We've talked about agriculture and astronomy, trade networks and warfare, daily life and cultural achievements. But there's so much more we didn't cover. The cultures of California beyond the Chumash, the peoples of the Great Basin, the societies of the subarctic, the complex chiefdoms of the Pacific Northwest beyond what we briefly discussed, the cultures of Mesoamerica and their connections to North American societies, the societies of the Amazon and the Andes. Every region had its own stories, its own achievements, its own tragedies. Medieval America was a vast, diverse, and dynamic place. It was home to millions of people living in thousands of communities, speaking hundreds of languages. It was a world of its own, connected internally through trade and cultural exchange, but largely isolated from the other inhabited continents. When that isolation ended in the late 1400s and early 1500s, the collision of worlds was catastrophic for the Americas. But the story doesn't end with catastrophe. Indigenous peoples survived. They adapted. They maintained their identities and cultures through centuries of oppression and attempted erasure. They're still here, still fighting for recognition, rights, and justice. The medieval American civilizations we've discussed aren't ancient history with no connection to the present. They're the past of living peoples, the foundation of ongoing cultures. So when you think about medieval history, don't just think about European knights and castles. Think about the mound builders of the Mississippi Valley. Think about the cliff dwellers of the Southwest. Think about the maritime hunters of the Arctic. Think about the sophisticated societies that existed across the Americas, building, creating, and thriving during the same centuries that Europeans were experiencing their Middle Ages. These civilizations are part of human history. They're part of world history. They deserve to be remembered, studied, and honored. And on that note, as the night deepens and your eyes grow heavy, I'll leave you with this thought. History is fuller, richer, and more complex than we're usually taught. There are always more stories to discover, more perspectives to consider, more forgotten people whose achievements deserve recognition. Sleep well, and maybe dream of ancient cities rising from the mist, of canoes crossing vast oceans, of astronomers tracking the stars, of farmers coaxing crops from desert soil, of artists carving beauty from stone and bone, of all the forgotten people who lived, loved, and left their marks on this continent long before it was called America.